about mass casualty incidents. This is probably one of the most challenging things you're going to deal with in EMS. I was in the military reserves for over a decade, and just as I moved up the chain of command, I got to practice being on-scene commander for a lot of MCIs, so I got a lot of practice at this. It is still very challenging because there'll never be two situations that are ever the same. So no matter how many training programs you do, a lot of it's going to be thinking on the fly and work with what you got, because they'll never be presented the same way. So hopefully by going through all this stuff today, you can take this information, because again, if we're going across the whole province, everybody has very different access to resources, environment, terrain, things like that. So if you take this information, apply it to your area as best you can, that's probably the best we can do with this information. So the standard definition of mass casualty incidents, I'm sure we all learned this at school, is basically when the number of casualties exceed your available resources. So for some people, that could be one car accident with 4 patients and you've only got 1 truck in your area. That's technically an MCI. For what we're doing for this program, we talk about MCIs, we're talking like a bigger scope. So like a bus rollover, a building collapse, big things that we really hope we never have to deal with, but are very possible. So when we get into mass casualties, we're going to talk about the big scheme of things and how to deal with things on a big scale. And then again, like I said, you can minimize it or change it or compartmentalize it to where you're working based on what you're doing. So the first part here is we're going to do a little interactive. So we're going to work through a case study as we go through this presentation. So the first one is you've been dispatched to a car versus bicycle accident. So your pager goes off, that's what comes through. Dispatch gives the information stating there's possibly up to 6 patients involved. 4 people of unknown age are currently trapped inside a vehicle, and there's possibly multiple pediatrics on scene. So when you guys first get this page, just feel free to chime in here. When you get this page, you know, you're sitting there in the crew room, this comes over the radio. What are your first thoughts?
Ask for fire and police if they're on route.
Awesome, right? So let's look at resources. Yeah, is other people being dispatched to help us? Because as a 2-person truck, we can't handle this. So yeah, absolutely. Awesome. More units was put in the text. Absolutely, right? So we asked dispatch. We're going to go over dispatch protocols for sending more units, but absolutely, we want to see if there's other people. Yeah. Yeah, you got the standard oh crap response there. Yeah, that's a good one. That's probably the first thing you think, and it's like, okay, what are we going to do? STARS is available, absolutely. So extra ground units, can we access to the helicopter? And we're also going to talk about helicopter dispatch as well today. So that's awesome you brought that up. So we want to pool our resources. So we get fire, do we have police? Do we have extra ground units? Is there a helicopter? Awesome, right? Because right there, like we have multiple patients. We don't know what's going on. Let's get as much help as we can. And honestly, the big rule is with mass casualty is get your resources first. It's always easier to cancel trucks than keep ordering more in because we just want to get our resources there. So that's awesome. So another one in the chat here, notify hospital to prep for the influx of patients. Awesome, especially depending on where you are, right? Because some places all you have is that community hospital. That's your only place to go. So if you can let the hospital know and get them prepped so they can put their disaster management into place, that is a great point to bring up as well, if you let them know what's going on. Because if we just start showing up ambulance after ambulance and they've got one physician and nurse on, then they're completely going to get overwhelmed and that's not going to work for resources. So yeah, notifying the facility, that's an awesome point to bring up for sure. So when we first get this dispatch, okay, so for Tom, they said here in Thompson, a standard procedure, let the hospital know. Okay. Well, I'm getting lots of stuff in text here. So when is location of airfields, talk with online medical support, awesome. Okay, so you can start talking with dispatch as well and say, is there any further information? See if caller's still on the line, so get more information as you go. So that's awesome too. That's some good stuff there. That's some good answers. Thank you. So when we actually get a dispatch like this through, when MTC gets a phone call like this and they're going to dispatch us, sorry, I'm a little distracted, I'm letting people in the room here. There are specific guidelines that MTCC uses to figure out how many resources they're going to send. Okay. So obviously, if we request more units, they're going to send more units. The other thing that dispatch might also do is that they're going to send a specific amount of trucks because again, you can't just radio and say send everybody. They still need ambulances for other calls. But what they sometimes do is they will geopose their trucks to stay within a 30-minute radius. So that way, if you have like 3 trucks responding, they'll move a truck. So that way, if you need another one, they can respond within a reasonable period of time as well. There's always at least 1 ground truck assigned. That pretty much makes sense, right? So, but they do have their guidelines. So with that, when it comes to dispatching actual ground units, they're going to look at the number of patients. So obviously, dispatch realizes 1 truck with 2 people in crew is not going to deal with 6 people effectively. So we need to send more trucks. So they're going to take that into account. Scene safety concerns. So with that, they may have paged out fire and police before they actually paged out EMS. We've done that a few times where fires already were basically following fire because they dispatched fire first. So they may not want to send all the ambulances right away because we have to make sure the scene is safe first. So reported types of injuries. So what's going on? Is it a lot like, is there 4 people just walking around, or are there people trapped in the car? So we have to look at that. So the mechanism of injury, if there's a high index of suspicion of severe injuries. So if you've got a car that just kind of rolled in the ditch and it's like, yeah, we just need to check it out, versus this car smoked a truck, flipped over, it's on its roof, now it's submerged in the water. Very big difference on response to that. So imminent delivery. Right, so if you got a baby that's going to be born, we don't know if it's complicated or not. Ideally, again, resource permitting, we'd ideally want 2 trucks for that, because we have 1 for the mom, 1 for the baby, because if the mom has some complications, baby has complications, as 1 crew, you cannot handle that. So distance to destination facility. Where is our closest hospital? So if you're 1 community hospital with 1 ambulance and your next town over is like 45 minutes, and that's the next closest hospital, next closest truck, they're probably going to get that truck rolling right away as soon as possible, because if we are going to be transporting multiple patients, it's going to take time to get them out of that scene. So, and then again, like I said, so the next available EMS resource. We'll get trucks rolling. Don't wait till you get on scene, and don't call people off until you get on scene. If you're like, yeah, you know what, I got this. 6 people, whatever, I'm good. Like, get the trucks rolling. It's always easier to call off resources than call in more. Because again, 45-minute wait for another truck. I've been there with an MCI, and trust me, it's not a fun place to be. It's very challenging. So based on where you work through the region, like you're saying in Thompson there, standard procedures, you let the hospital know. So depending on what your regional operating procedures, sometimes they don't want all the trucks sent at once. They want it distributed a certain way. So that's kind of region by region. So dispatch will keep that in consideration as well. And another one is critical patients. So usually if there's critical patients on scene, dispatch will send 1 truck per critical patient. So if you arrive on scene and you have 4 red patients, they're going to try and send you 4 trucks. That's kind of what their policy is. So for dispatch, their definition of critical patients consists of, so abnormal or deteriorating neurological status, so unresponsive, altered LOC, that's a concern. Cardiorespiratory arrest, suspected or confirmed, so, you know, dead people are kind of high priority. Threat to maternal or fetal life, so like we said, if there's childbirth and there's complication with the mother or the baby or both, that is considered critical incident. So airway compromise, severe respiratory distress, again, chance of death, high priority patients. So multiple traumas associated with above features. So again, altered LOC, any kind of MOI, or suspicion of significant injury based on mechanisms. So again, car flipped on its roof, high suspicion there, altered LOC, people unresponsive, ejected from vehicles, that's critical. So when it comes to these calls, it was also brought up that we want to get fire, police, helicopters. So we're going to talk about how dispatch sends them to us. So the first one we're going to talk about is fire. So when we get dispatch fire, it's dispatched by provincial, they are dispatched by provincial 911. So either they get a call from 911 and it goes through MTCC and they send it to provincial 911, or it goes right through provincial 911, depending on your system where you are. So with that, fire will always be notified by dispatch and or 911 for the following situations. Burns or explosions. Makes sense. Buildings on fire, we want the fire department there. Carbon monoxide, inhalation, hazmat, CBRN, so chemical, biological, radiation, we want the fire involved. Traffic incidents, so that could be either just to suppress fire from the actual vehicles that are burning, or just more so just to help with traffic control as well. They're always appreciated for that. It's considered for water incidents, so drowning, diving, scuba accidents, because again, as EMS, we may be trained in water rescue, but we don't have the equipment on our trucks for that. That would be better be done by the fire department and rescue services. And obviously, they're going to send fire if we ask for fire. So if we radio in, like with that original page, like you're saying, we've got 6 people, there's a car accident, has fire been sent? And they're like, would you like fire? And it's like, yes, they'll send fire. Also with the police, so when we dispatch the police, dispatch works with the dispatch service of RCMP. There's town-specific police services, First Nations police, railway police, and they can actually contact out-of-province police, such as the OPP, and we can work with them as well, depending on where your boundaries are, where you work. So they work with those dispatches as well, kind of interagency. And dispatch will always send the police for the following things. So obviously any safety concerns for the caller, the patient, or EMS. If it's not safe for us to be there, I'm sure a lot of you have probably been staged while we wait for the police. They're going to let them take care of it first, make sure it's safe for us to be there. So assaults, obviously if there's ongoing assaults, we're not going to deal with that. That's the police's job, so they're going to call them in. So again, same thing as the fire though, with carbon monoxide, inhalation, hazmats, we're gonna get the police. And sometimes, especially with hazmats, scene control is huge because if there's a toxic spill, so like some fertilizer spill, we don't want people coming in there, so they can help with crowd control and to help us secure the scene. So cardiac respiratory arrests. I've been on a lot of calls where the police show up and they actually help us with the arrests, depending on where you work. A lot of times though, they are there more so for the police side of it, where they're gonna investigate, especially suspicious deaths. So traffic incidents, again, huge. It's great if we have the RCMP there to help us direct traffic if fire's not there yet. We actually had one call we did on the highway where it was rush hour. People were still driving highway speed and someone actually T-boned the fire truck that was on scene. So we requested police because we thought they were just automatically dispatched and they weren't. So they sent police right away because that was a bit of a mess. So it's really great if we have police on scene for that. And again, like I said, if we request police, same thing as fire. If we get on scene, it's not what was advertised. So either we withdraw because it's not safe, we call for police, or we just appreciate them for traffic control or just to assist us. We can request police and dispatch will send them. So we talked about requesting STARS, definitely an excellent resource to have. So we have our helicopter emergency services, and right now, obviously, STARS is the go-to for our helicopter care. So within the defined response areas, STAR will respond to on-scene calls as well as IFTs. So we've done quite a few out of hospitals where STARS will land at wherever the helipad is or closest available landing area. We'll go get the crew, bring them to the hospital, they'll stabilize and they'll transfer out, or they'll land on the highway or in the field and do calls with us. So it definitely depends on what's available, but they're able to do both. So dispatch really requests that they are involved in communication back and forth and they can help set that up. So there is a specific channel. I'm not going to get into the whole setting up LZs and how to radio each other. That's a totally different thing. If that's something you are interested in, if you go to the actual STARS website, they do have a video on how to set up an LZ and radio communications. So I'd recommend if that's something you're interested in, you can look that up later. But dispatch does request that we involve them in all our communication. So they have that record and they have recordings of the communication that took place between the ground crew and the air crew. So this is the best map I could find of the service area of STARS. So the darker blue circles are within the 1 hour flight radius and the lighter blue circles are in the 2 hour flight radius. So if you kind of look there, you notice that they're pretty much the southern part of Manitoba, you got full coverage there. So as you get further north, it kind of gets less and less. So again, depending on where you work, you might have different resources available to you. If you actually look at the Regina helicopter, it does overlap, and the Saskatoon one for that matter, it does overlap into Manitoba. I didn't get a specific answer whether they would be willing to send helicopters from other provinces here. I personally have not heard of that happening. If anybody has, let me know. But we do have a specific certain flight area. So with that, sorry, go ahead.
STARS has come from Regina to Republic, not as a primary, but as a part of the triage.
Okay, awesome. So basically what happens is when we request STARS, dispatch will contact and see if they're flying right now. So if they're on another call, if they're actually in the air right now, so they're going to talk to them. So based on the call details, the transport physician will decide whether STARS will accept the mission or not. Again, there may be multiple calls coming in at once, so they may have to triage on their side, or they may be already in the air and we just can't take it. So right now, STARS Winnipeg base currently has 2 deployable aircraft. They're actively used one at a time, but there is a possibility for using a second aircraft. One of the incidents I was told by the STARS staff was when the Homeboat crash happened, that happened at their shift change. So they were actually able to send multiple helicopters because they had 2 full crews and available helicopters. They were actually able to send multiple helicopters more than the normal. So they accessed their spare helicopters and were able to actually send more resources. In Manitoba as well, in Ontario, we have Orange Air, and STARS is actually able to request assistance from Orange Air to come across the border and help us out in Manitoba as well. So I always find it interesting. People are like, well, I call STARS, but they're not flying. So how come they don't fly? So this is one that I asked about. So this is what was actually given to me by STARS of why they don't fly. So severe thunderstorm along with hail, not really the best place to be flying a helicopter through. So if there's lots of lightning, it's just a safety issue. So freezing rain, freezing fog with low visibility, obviously that's not safe to fly in either. Wind speed in excess of 100 kilometers an hour. So if there's high levels of wind, you're in a helicopter, it's going to get pushed around. I was actually fortunate to do some training at the STARS hangar, and I was talking to one of the pilots about why don't you fly, can you not fly when it's really windy? And the response I got from the pilot was, it's like, we can fly, we just can't do anything in the back. Because what'll actually happen is the wind can get so strong, it'll cause a rocking of the helicopter. And the pilot's like, we can fly in that, but you cannot do patient care in the back. That's just a safety issue for the medical crew. So if it's excessively windy, you could fly a helicopter, but you can't give medical care, so they may not respond for that reason. So again, visibility issues, 3 miles at night with a ceiling of 2,500 feet for night operations. So obviously they can't see, you can't fly. And wind shear. So that's a difference in wind speed or direction over a relatively short distance in the atmosphere. So that can cause issues again. So high winds always causes problems. So another thing that was brought up when I was talking with STARS about this is that they may delay actually launching because they may wait for their transport position to actually come along with them. Because if we know we're going to an MCI, they might be able to help us out with triage, treatment, and they might actually, if we already know we're transporting to a local hospital, they may not meet us on scene. They may actually go to the hospital. So their physician and their staff can actually help that facility with the treatment of the mass casualty patients. So they may actually delay flights so they can get the appropriate crew on board to help out the local facilities. Any questions about any of that? All right, cool. So first on scene, this is always the challenging part. If anybody's gone to an MCI and pulled up first and no one else is there yet, this is always the most stressful part of the job I find with MCIs. So when we arrive on scene, what do we do first? So you've got this multi-car pileup. And first thing we do is we do the oh crap, and we don't just get on the radio and say send everybody and everything. We've got a bad scene. There's actually steps we want to take. So when arriving first on scene, we always have to fight the urge to rush and just start helping people. Like, we need to see what's going on first. We have that very honorable instinct in EMS that I want to help as many people as I can. I see people that are hurt, messed up. I want to run in there and help them out. Not always the best way to be. So that can actually make things worse in an MCI when we just run in and start treating people. So we want to sit for a second. Again, easier said than done, but we want to do that windshield assessment there. So we want to take a look around at what we see, talk to our partner. We radio fires on scene. What are they dealing with? And we can also get a hold of dispatch and tell them what's going on with us. So we pull up, we see we have multiple vehicles. We need fire. We're probably going to need extrication. We need police for traffic control. We need more trucks. And that's before we get out the truck. Get those resources rolling. Look at what we have. And again, safety, right? So if we have people walking around injured, is it even safe for us to be there? Especially when we think about something like a chemical agent being involved. We work in a lot of rural areas, lots of farms, lots of chemicals being transported. Is it safe for us to even get out the truck right now? What's the nature of the MCI? We really want to take a look around on what's going on first before we jump out and starting helping people. So here's another one here. So this is actually a Walmart in the States. The roof collapsed. So if we had a building like this and we just jumped out of our truck and started treating the first people we saw, then we took off, there'd be a lot of stuff we'd be missing. So we really need to take a good situational assessment before we just start bandaging up people. Okay. So again, like I said, check the whole scene first. We really want to help people. It's very hard to ignore people crying for help. I'm not going to lie, but we need to make sure that we've got a whole assessment on the scene so we get the appropriate resources coming to us. So there's two types of incident sites. So the first one is a static incident. So for example, we got this dirt bike crash here. So basically with a static incident, it's like it's a one-time thing. We know what's happened. We can see what's happened. So it's very that specific area. So you get 3 cars hit each other, 3 cars hit each other, that's all that's going on. It's very obvious what's going on. So it's not going to expand, it's just in that one area. So for example, you got 2 boats collide, 2 boats crash into each other, it's very obvious, it's contained to that one crash there. It's not going to move anywhere else. So there's a little chance of the scene actually getting worse or getting bigger. So again, a couple cars hit each other, that's your whole scene. There's not gonna, unless there's other cars going to smash into those, the scene's pretty much contained. It's not going to expand anywhere. The next one, and this is the much more challenging one, is dynamic incidents. So these are ones where things are going to keep happening by the time we get there. So there may be multiple locations. So for example, this is a picture here of a tornado touchdown, and it basically went right through a whole housing development. So with this, as soon as you pull up, you know you're overwhelmed. We need to call in for resources. But the thing is that with this, you've got the tornado touchdown, but there's also the chance of gas leaks, electrical, all that other stuff as well. So there's a chance that it could still be expanding, and there's more chance of people getting hurt. So it may have a large number of casualties that just cannot be handled by our regional resources. Another example of a dynamic incident, so this was from the States. We had a protest last year. That person decided to drive through the protest as opposed to just letting them protest. So obviously that's a dynamic issue, because if that car is driving through people, we're going to have patients all over the place. And another thing as well, if that car is still driving around, they're going to keep creating chaos and mayhem and patients for us. So there's a chance there's still ongoing threats to both us and to our casualties. So the problem with this as well, though, is that when we deal with these dynamic incidents, people aren't going to sit around and wait for us. I don't know if you've ever gone to one of these dynamic incident calls where you show up and everybody's running past you trying to get away from the threat because it's still ongoing. So with that, we're going to miss a lot of patients. A lot of people will just drive themselves to local hospitals. And with it as well, it can really affect the care of our patients because they may go to the wrong hospitals. So this is when you start seeing your community hospitals getting overwhelmed with critical patients because they didn't want to wait for us. They just jumped in their own cars or ran away from scene and went to whatever hospital was closest. This one, another one from the States here. So this is just from an active shooter scene. Again, ongoing threat. The police are trying to get the casualties out as they can. So we're going to keep getting casualties. And obviously, if there's gunshots, people are going to run. If someone's scared, they're going to take off. So people may not even get seen on scene. They might just go home. So we might miss out on a lot of casualties with that. So that makes a huge triage issue when it comes to incidents. So we want to try and find all the people and try to corral them as soon as we can, because we don't want people just running off to the local hospital. Okay. And another big thing, we want to look after ourselves as well. There won't be a lot of defined borders to these type of incidents, so it may be hard to actually set up treatment areas, triage areas. So these present a lot of their own challenges. Okay. So we want to try and keep things as brief as possible, because again, if people are running all over the place, we don't have time to spend 10 minutes with each person. We need to just check everybody and send them to a designated area as fast as we can. And like I said before, people just bypass us. They may not even stop to talk to us. They just get in their own vehicles or just run away from the scene and go to where they feel safe. So we might miss a lot of patients. So checking for scene for everybody is huge. The thing is as well with patients, they may actually just come to us, and a lot of times you'll get your walking patients that have like arm injuries or minor fractures, and they start help me, but meanwhile you've got 3 people down on the ground over there. They're going to distract us as well. So we need to make sure we're triaging appropriately still, and again, try not to be overwhelmed. Very much easier said than done, but we want to make sure that we're helping everybody. So don't get distracted by people flooding the ambulance. We want to make sure we're dealing with the critical patients as well. In regards to geography, that, again, everybody works in different areas. I don't know everybody's geography. That can create a lot of problems as well with dynamic incidents, because working in a town, like with that guy that's driving through the crowds, going through streets and stuff, that's going to cause issues for access, where people are, just resources available. So that's all stuff we really need to look at when we deal with these dynamic incidents. And so we arrive on scene, get a good picture of what we're dealing with, and get an idea of how we can get resources to help. So here's a dynamic incident. So this is actually from the Boston Marathon bombing a few years ago. So as you can see here, just in the actual picture, there's a little bit of everything. We have people down on scene. We have people just wandering around. I picked this picture because it actually shows that one gentleman carrying someone away from scene. We don't know where he's going to go. Is he going in an ambulance? Is he going to throw the person in their own car or a cop car and take off? So with this, it can cause a lot of issues. So we want to make sure we try and contain the scene as best we can with our resources and triage appropriately. Does anybody have anything to say about that picture? Like, has anybody come across some kind of dynamic incident like that where it's just been chaos and mayhem? Okay, so there's one here that said they had a bus accident and the parents picked up their kids before their triage. Yep, that's definitely dynamic incident for sure. And that's going to be challenging, especially with kids. We're going to talk about triaging kids later, but kids present their own problems because parents want to protect their kids. So that if you're saying, hey, you can't leave yet, they're probably not going to listen to you, right? That instinct takes over. So for sure, that can cause a lot of issues, especially with kids. That's a very good point. Thank you. Anybody else? Not specifically a bombing. Hopefully no one's had to deal with that. Awesome. So it's brought up here, you need to be aware of secondary devices, explosions. Yep, for sure. Yeah, we're going to talk about explosions later, but that's a very good point to bring up now. So secondary explosions, not such a big deal in Canada right now. So they were saying here it's more of an issue in Europe. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So if there's one explosion, always be cautious of second ones. So sometimes I know not really such an issue in North America right now, but they'll deliberately booby trap. So that way they get first responders as well. I know in the States, they've had that happen a couple times where someone will call saying there's mass incident and then start shooting at the first responders. They'll shoot someone, first responders show up, and they use them as target practice as well. So again, with dynamic incidents, we always want to be careful with this. We always want to do our assessment for threats. Again, we really need to fight that urge to run in and just start helping people. We have to make sure the scene is safe and somewhat controlled because we can become casualties and victims as well. Awesome, good stuff. So when we first get on scene, we want to communicate the extent of an MCI. So we use the acronym methane to basically describe what we're going to do when we get to these. So the first thing we do is we're going to do major incident declarations. We're going to contact dispatch and tell them what's going on. We're going to declare an incident so that way we can start getting the ball rolling. So within our region, part of that would be contacting our disaster management so that way they can get their protocols into place. We can start getting extra resources in. So the exact location, the precise location of the incident, staging area if applicable. So where are you exactly? And I'm sure everybody's been dispatched to call us like I'm next to a tree, near a highway. Like mass casualties, we need to be as specific as possible. So nearest intersections, best way to approach. Especially working rurally, sometimes your closest road available will be 2 miles away to access where you are. So if you've got that gravel road, you've got a mile road here, and then you miss a mile road, and the next one's a couple miles over, we need to tell them where we are and how to access the area because we don't want to block everybody in as well. So we have to think about getting in and out of the scene. So try to be as specific as possible with location and how people can approach it and approach it safely. We don't want to have fire trucks and police officers driving through giant debris fields. That's not realistic. So the type of incident, the nature of the incident, how many vehicles, buildings. So again, if it's a massive house fire, we might want to tell them there's something on fire. That's kind of a big deal versus something that's possibly biological or a chemical. If there's a chemical spill, we're going to have to call in special teams for that to deal with that. And we may not ever get out the truck. We might just say, you know what, there's a giant chemical spill. We'll back it up. We'll stay safe, but we need to relay that so that way fire knows, police knows, because if we're safe and we're like, yeah, we're good, chemical spill, and then fire goes in there and they get affected, it's not going to help anybody. So we have to make sure that we're telling dispatch what kind of incident we're coming across. So again, same thing, hazards, both present and potential. So again, with that dynamic incidents, so we've got a multiple car accident here, but we've got a lot of angry people that came out of the car. So there's potential for violence as well, not just the car accident. So we definitely need a police present. So make sure you bring that up. So access, like I was saying before, we want to make sure we're telling people how to access the scene appropriately, especially with MCIs, because if there's buildings involved, roads are blocked off, we don't want to bottleneck our people in. I've been to MCIs where it's happened both sides, where we show up in the ambulance first and we're parked right next to the scene. Fire shows up and they park behind us and our ambulance is basically stuck there for the duration. We can't get it out. And I've had it happen the other way where we've been at a fire and EMS and police parked too close to the fire trucks and the fire trucks needed to go refill their tankers and we had to get like 6 vehicles out of the way so they could get their fire truck out. So we want to make sure people are parking in appropriate spaces. So if you're coming in and you're on scene commander and you're radioing saying, you know what, park a mile away, we'll call you guys in as we need you, as opposed to having everybody is lined up right behind the scene because it just may not be safe. And again, we don't want people getting stuck in there. Okay. Number of casualties, dead or injured on scene. So we want to do a quick triage. And again, this is why it's important to get an idea of what we're dealing with. If we just start dealing with one really sick person, we're going to miss the 6 other people that might be injured as well. And that might delay the number of ambulances that dispatch is going to send us. So we want to make sure we're getting as accurate an account of people as we can so we can actually get a full determination of the size of the problem. Is there 4? Great. Is there 20? We need to know that. It's a big difference in response. And emergency services, who's already there and what do we need? So if we radio in and say we need more resources, we have 2 ambulances, we need 2 more ambulances, fire's already on scene, can we get the helicopter? Have they landed yet? We need to talk back and forth. Lots of good communication is huge with these incidents. We need to make sure we have all the resources we need. So is everybody good? Any questions? If you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the chat or just bring it up. Everybody's good? Awesome. So MCI multipliers. So as if it's not hard enough dealing with MCIs, multiple injured, sick people, there are other things that can actually create more issues when we deal with an MCI. So these are called MCI multipliers. So the physical location, access, egress. So like I talked about, you're on a rural road, it may be only single lane, it may be very difficult to get vehicles in and out, and you've got 10 people hurt in a tractor rollover, whatever. It's going to be hard to get people around. So that can make it big difficult. So number of access points, the distance between exits on a highway. So if you think about highways, so if you're on a bridge over a highway, there might be only one way to get to that bridge based on where the accident is. So are they going to have to access the road 2 miles down? Is there another on-ramp? That can cause especially transport issues for sure. Location, speed, and density of traffic. I'm a big fan of never trusting the highway. I've almost been smoked by a car more times than I can count. We actually did one on Highway 1 where it was complete whiteout conditions. We went to a 4-car MVC and you couldn't see anything. I think that was the only time I've actually been scared of dying on a call because people were still driving highway speed through the scene and the police said they closed the road down, but obviously people didn't care. So I almost got clipped quite a few times just going around trying to triage patients. So be very careful with traffic. So kind of ties into that weather or road conditions. So with weather, obviously it gets cold here. So if it's minus 50, we need to keep in mind that we don't want our patients dying of hypothermia as well. So that can make things very complicated. And even for us working, we're going to get cold. We're not going to be working optimally when it's really cold outside. Roadway conditions as well. Is it really icy? So our nearest ambulance might be 45 minutes away on a good day, but now the roads are icy. It's going to take an hour and a half because they can't go over 50. So that's going to cause a lot of issues with getting resources to us. And also with weather, maybe the helicopter can't fly. So that resource is right off the table. We can't access it. Time of day. So obviously nighttime is going to make things a lot more complicated when we're working in poor light, no light. It's going to make things a lot more difficult. It might be more difficult to find people. When I read this, the first thing that came to my mind was time of day is if you've ever worked in Manitoba and it's dusk and the mosquitoes are bad, it sucks because you're trying, I don't know if anybody's done these calls when you're in the ditch with the car and you're trying to talk to the patient and you're just got a mouthful of mosquitoes the whole time, it sucks. So just that alone makes a bad situation worse. So staffing levels, if you don't have all your trucks up and running, you just don't have resources. Same thing with fire departments. A lot of fire departments are volunteer. If you only have 2 volunteers available that day, you may not get all the fire trucks you need. Same thing with police. Where are the police? Where are they dispatched to? Are they already on calls? Are they down cars as well? Because I'm sure a lot of us have been in calls where it's like, where's the nearest police? Oh, they're 45 minutes away, they're en route. Sometimes that happens. So that can make things more difficult for us as well. So the massive debris field. So like I said before, we don't want vehicles driving through debris fields, and it kind of sucks for us too, because if there's lots of broken glass, we might have patients on the ground. We have to look out for ourselves, make sure we're not injuring ourselves. So it just adds an extra hazard to an already complicated situation. So other simultaneous incidents that drain available resources. So I have been working where we've had multiple MCIs at the same time. So we get one, we start allocating resources to that one MCI, then all of a sudden dispatch comes through saying, actually, we've got another incident on this side of the lake here. And then so we have to start deciding who's going where. And that can be really complicated, especially when we talk about staffing issues, what resources are available. Because now we don't just have, oh yeah, send everybody. It's like, well, actually, we have to move people over here, but we still have to keep trucks available to do primary calls as well. So that can really affect what's available to you. Location of specialty teams and resources. So like I was saying, there is a special team that can deal with biological chemical spills, things like that. The one we went to, they sent the team from Brandon. And I think we waited about 2 hours for them to show up. So we just basically sat on the side of the highway blocking off the road, waiting for 2 hours for them to come deal with this chemical spill before we could really do anything. Same thing if you're dealing like further more remote. So if you're calling in SARTEX, like they come out of Winnipeg and there's flight times. So you got to think about things like that. What's actually available. So another one is ambulances from another system arriving on the scene or self-dispatching. So people are like, you know what, I think they could use another truck. We're just going to go anyways. I don't care if I've been told to geopost, we're going to go jump in. So you might be expecting 4 trucks and all of a sudden you get 6. So all of a sudden you're like, okay, what do we do with all these trucks? Another thing as well is that if people are coming from other regions, I know we all share the same dispatch and everything, but we still are on regional areas, so we may not be able to communicate with each other. So if you're approaching from the south and they're approaching from the north and they start doing their thing in the north and we're doing our thing in the south, that can cause problems because there's a lot of communication issues with that. So other ones, ambulances are unfamiliar with district's MCI operational procedures. So like I said, if it's a true incident, mass casualty incident here, like a true disaster, within the IRHA, we're supposed to contact our disaster management so we can send them to help organize the scene a bit more properly. But again, if you're coming from another region, I highly doubt you have that phone number. I don't even know if everybody in our region has that phone number. But that can definitely cause operational issues. Like I said, if one person's trying to do one thing, the other group's trying to do the other, it can kind of cause an overlap and issues. The other thing as well, just with that, is it might just be interagency. So if the police have, when I talk to D Division, they have their standard RCMP response to MCIs. Fire departments have their response to MCIs. We have our way we approach MCIs. So if we're all trying 3 different approaches, that can cause overlapping and issues as well. So we really need to talk with each other. Another big issue we come across with MCIs is just hospital issues. Where do we take our patients? If your closest hospital is 45 minutes away and they're closed because they're either completely filled up already or they don't have a physician, that's going to cause problems, because when we look at extended transport times from these MCIs, that's going to actually, I'm not saying don't transport your patients, but when we go, we're going to lose that ambulance for like an hour and a half, and then they're going to have to drive back an hour and a half. So right there, that resource is gone, as opposed to taking the 20-minute drive to the closest hospital. So that can really make things more complicated for us. In case you didn't notice, there's a lot of things that can complicate an MCI here. So communication coverage gaps. I don't know if any of you have experienced it, but it is extremely frustrating when you're trying to call dispatch and your radios keep toning out because you can't get a good signal. You start talking and you get that. That can create a lot of frustration and issues. And just talking interagency. I've done a couple MCIs now where I've got like 2 different radios on. One's for open air for the region. The other one is on interagency. So we can talk with fire and we can talk with dispatch and we can talk with stars. So sometimes being on the radio can create a lot of issues itself, because if you got multiple radios squawking at you, that can make things a lot more complicated. So failure to establish incident command divisions or groups early enough. So we don't have someone that's actually running the show. We're going to talk about what incident command is involved with, what to do when you're first on scene, and make yourself the incident commander. We need someone in charge. If no one actually takes charge, and I'm sure everybody's aware, if you don't have a good team leader, the rest of the team just falls apart. So it's no different with an MCI, just on a bigger scale. And like I said, if we don't have that defined team leader, even for like fire, police, EMS, and we're all just kind of running around doing our own thing, it's not effective. It's not going to work for us. We need to set up that incident commander, and we need to make sure that we're liaisoning with the other fire and police as well, so we're all on the same page. Otherwise, it's just going to be everybody running around. So with this, we're going to talk about the different roles in a little bit on an MCI, of what roles are. So if ideally we're supposed to have incident vests, determining who's the actual on-scene commander, who's doing triage, who's doing this, who's doing that. So if you don't have identified who the team leader is, who the incident commander is, if it's that guy over there, that doesn't really help anybody. So we want to make sure that everybody's roles are identified as best we can. So later improper access directions or staging instruction to upcoming units. So like I said before, we really want to prevent those bottlenecks. So if we don't tell people where to go, we don't tell people where to park, everybody's just going to drive to scene, and then we get cars stuck. And that doesn't work well for us, because it's really hard to get patients out if you've got a fire truck blocking your exit route. So we want to make sure everybody's on the same board of how to access and exit areas. So like it says here, ongoing crashes, if there's ongoing gunfire explosions, you probably shouldn't be there. But again, safety first, right? So like I said, in the States, they're having trouble with that, where people were shooting someone, waiting for responders, and then shooting at the police and fire. Like was mentioned by one of the people in the group here before about explosions. If there's one explosion, it's possibly a second, and not necessarily like in a terrorist way, but again, if there's some kind of chemicals involved, propane involved, things like that, things that are explosives, that can cause secondary explosions as well. Ongoing crashes. I got to work in the city of Winnipeg when I was doing my ACP, and we actually had one where we were going to a car accident on Osborne, and someone was busy staring at the fire trucks and actually smoked another car. So we actually had a secondary scene after our first scene. So people driving, I don't ever trust traffic. That can cause problems as well. So now our one MCI could turn into two MCIs. Any questions about any of that? Awesome, we'll just carry on. So establishing instant command. So this is probably one of the most important things, and it is something that really, I don't want to say is neglected, but we're not the best at, because again, like I said before, a lot of people, we get on scene, we want to help people. We see people bleeding, crying, yelling for help. We want to help people. But we really need to establish instant command. We need that on-scene commander first to try and get everything organized. So we really need to fight that urge to just grab people and go. We need to make sure that we've got some kind of organization of what we're doing here. So we want to give an on-scene report and assume command. So ideally, we want the first truck that arrives on scene, you make yourself the on-scene commander. So that's usually the highest trained person in the vehicle, or just whoever's turn it is that time, whatever you want to do. And we need to contact dispatch and say, this is truck 02. We are assuming on-scene command. And then that way dispatch knows, and then that way all communications can go through you, so they know who you're talking to. And that is hugely important. We need to have that communications, because now we need to direct other trucks. We need to know who to talk to for getting extra resources. And dispatch, when you tell them you're the on-scene commander, you're going to be the person they're radioing. So you need to make sure you radio in and say you're assuming command. So assign incident management system roles and other ambulance units as they arrive on scene. So again, I'm teaching this to a lot of different areas of the province here. I don't know what resources you have available to you, but if you have enough people, you can start delegating roles as ambulances show up. So things such as a triage officer, transportation officer, safety officer, treatment officer. We're going to go over all these roles in a little bit. We can start delegating people. It's like, I'm going to be the incident commander. My partner's going to start doing triage. Next crew that shows up, it's like, okay, I need you to start corralling trucks for me so we don't have any more on scene. We need to start delegating all these different roles to people as best we can based on our resources. A lot of times there's just going to be two of you, so you might have to double, triple up what you're doing here. So perform a rapid hazard assessment, establish a safe zone to operate. So again, like we talked about before, don't just rush out and start helping people. We need to make sure it's safe. If it's not safe, we make it safe. So again, is fire on scene and say, hey, I'm noticing over here that this vehicle is not doing too great. We need you guys to stabilize it. So question about when do we transfer command? We'll get to that. Don't worry. Thank you for asking though. We will get to that. So we want to make sure, again, safety first. Is it safe for us to even start helping patients, or do we need to stabilize the scene first? And is instant command, that's something we need to look at, and we need to make sure we're getting the appropriate resources. Traffic control, you already know my opinion on traffic. Don't trust cars. We want to make sure it's a safe area. So like I said, even that one call we went on, we thought the highway was safe, and then we got a fire truck smoked by a car. So again, we want to make sure that our area is safe, and if it's not, we make it safe. We can't treat patients appropriately if we're worried about getting hit by a car the whole time. It's just not a good scene. And as incident commander as well, you're kind of the go-to for resources. Like I said, when you make that announcement that I'm the on-scene commander, dispatch is going to go through you saying how many ambulances do you need, is STARS required, fire, police, and if you need more, they're going to go back and forth through you. So that way, at least for dispatch, they know who they're talking to, and they're not just talking to whatever truck shows up right after you. So another thing you can do as the incident command is designate radio talk groups. Like I was saying, we have our TAC 2 channel, so that way just everybody that's on scene switches TAC 2, so that way you're not talking over the actual dispatch for your region, so they can still dispatch other calls. Also with that, we can look at going into agencies, so we can talk with our fire departments as well as with EMS as well. So try and get that set up before you start doing stuff, because that way everybody can radio each other and we all know what channel we're on. Because if I'm talking on TAC 2 and the truck that just showed up is on the regional talk group, we're not going to hear each other. So that's going to cause communication issues. So we need to make sure we're all on the same page for communications. And obviously we want to radio triage and updates to dispatch. They need to know what's going on. If it's a big enough incident, dispatch might actually just assign a single dispatcher to our mass casualty, and that'll be them for the duration of the event. So we want to make sure we're keeping them updated, because if we like, oh, there's only 3 people here, and then we start looking around, we find 4 more, we need to radio that in, because that definitely changes the dynamics of the scene. So we obviously, like I said, we want to stabilize our hazards, and we want to make sure that if it is not safe, we can remove our patients as long as it's safe for us to do so as well, and take them to a treatment area. And we'll talk about setting up a treatment area in a second. So the actual incident commander. So when you take command of a scene, this role is ideally filled by the highest trained person. So depending what your experience is, so if you're the only person that's ever dealt with an MCI before, you get to be the incident commander. If people are more comfortable in that role, then ideally pick them. Don't pick the paramedic that's like freaking out, like, oh, what did I do? Who do you do? Try and take a level-headed person, one that's more calm at the scene, things like that. So delegate is appropriate. Sometimes nobody wants to be incident commander, but someone has to take it. So you might just be, you're the only ICP there, so that's your job now. You're the incident commander. So ideally someone who knows the guidelines, available resources, knows who to call, things like that. So ideally the most experienced person. So this person's also going to work with the other incident commanders. So again, working alongside fire, police, communication. If I haven't said it enough, like we really need to work with each other well, so that way we're working on the same page. We're not all just doing our own thing. Okay. So the person that takes incident commander is the incident commander until they are relieved. Okay, so depending on how that goes. So if you are a new PCP and you're working with another new PCP and you're just doing the best you can, then when your supervisor shows up, you're it until they take over. So with that, you also need to do a transfer of command. So if a higher ranking, more qualified person comes over and they say, I'll take over as incident commander, there's a couple of things we want to do with that. So we need to do a formal transfer of incident command. So there's going to be reports. So just like when we do report a patient handover at the hospital, we need to do a scene report to the new on-scene commander. So if your supervisor shows up and they're going to take over incident command, we need to let them know where we're at, what we've done, all that good stuff there. So it's like we arrived on scene, we noticed we had these problems, we called for fire police, we found 4 people, we have a helicopter on the way, there's 2 more ambulances. That all needs to be transferred over. The other thing as well is that if we do transfer on-scene commander, we need to make sure everybody's aware of it. You don't just say, oh yeah, you're in charge, and take off and start dealing with the patient, because then a fire captain's going to come over looking for you, asking what's going on. They're not going to know. So you have to make sure it's made aware to everybody on scene that you've done an official changeover of command. So the question was, when do we transfer command? So when it comes to transferring command, again, it's whenever someone more qualified shows up, or you just need to. So if you're the only ALS medic there and there's a lot of people that need ALS care, that could be a reason to transfer incident command. But again, we need to make sure everybody's on the same page, give a report, make sure everybody's aware of it, and then you can transfer command over. Okay. So do you have any questions about that? I find incident command and switching over incident command can cause some issues. But again, just like anything else with an ALS call, when the ALS medic comes over, you would give them a report, they would start taking over care, everybody's aware that you're the primary care provider. Same idea with incident commander, we give a report, we make sure everybody's aware of it, and we carry on. Any other questions about that at all?
Hi, Mike.
Hi there.
Just wanted to, I know in the past with some MCIs that I've been commander on, I find that some of the responding units sometimes don't always make contact with the incident command and start rushing to different areas, maybe going into hot zones but not understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're going to cover, or?
I'm hoping through the process of this whole presentation, everyone will kind of get the idea that we don't want to just start grabbing people and going. That is really not what we're doing with MCIs. MCIs are a very different approach for sure. So again, when we show up on scene, we make sure we do, again, like I said before earlier, it's very hard to not help people right away, especially if there's kids on scene. That's, you have a school bus rollover and there's crying kids everywhere. Really, it's really hard not to run out there and start helping them. But the importance of being the incident commander is, like, it's the most important job on scene. We need to get a good grip on the scene. We need to make sure it's safe. Okay. So a question that came in the chat here is, do you establish a command post where all commanders are together? If you have the resources and the ability to do that, that would be absolutely ideal. So when you establish a command post, so that would be when you have your EMS incident commander, your fire, your police, and you're all working together and you're all talking together in one group. So that totally depends on where you work. From just my personal experience in our region here, a lot of times it's honestly, I just get a lot of cardio in because we'll run and deal with our things and we'll relay it to fire and then they'll do their thing and you're running back and forth. But if you can get like a centralized hub, so if you can say, okay, this ambulance is command and everybody comes through there, that would be absolutely ideal. So the question to, do you establish a command post? That would be the preferred way to go for sure. Because we definitely want to work together. But if you're the only one on scene, we just need to have that specific incident commander first. And again, so that way everybody knows who to talk to and we're not just running in, grabbing people and going. Honestly, that is probably the worst thing you can do in MCI is show up. That guy's really messed up, throw him in your truck and take off. I don't want to put down anybody that's done that. Stuff happens, but that's probably the least effective way to deal with an MCI. So I definitely want to establish an incident commander. Was there any other questions about that at all? Is this all making sense so far? It's a lot of information, but everybody's good? All right, carry on. So incident commander, obviously like everything else we teach in EMS, we want to make sure it's safe for us. So your first priority for incident commander is make sure the scene is safe. What are our hazards? Again, just that windshield survey of the scene. Okay, I'm in one ambulance, there's 2 of us, we have 6 cars piled up, I need more people, this isn't safe, we need the car stabilized before we can start doing extrication. This is stuff we need to assess as the incident commander. If we just run in and start grabbing people out of cars and the car lands on us, that's not going to help us because it rolls over, not going to help us at all. So we definitely need to make sure it's safe. So the big rule is if it's not safe, make it safe. So as part of the incident commander is, again, stop other medics from running into scene. We want to make sure it's safe for everybody. So make a safe zone for crews to operate. And so this can be either you just park your ambulance a certain way to block off the highway, you delegate fire trucks, you get police, use traffic cones, whatever you have. And work with dispatch too, radio and say, hey, you know what, we have a couple fire trucks here, but they're dealing with fires. Can we have a couple more, or just even police just to help block off the area because it's not a safe area to be. So we want to rapidly survey the scene, hazards or safety concerns, and decide if it's more effective to treat patients in place or move them to a safer area. So again, if it's a matter of that, you know what, it's just a car in the ditch, but there's lots of people in there, do we actually need to start dragging them out, or can we just start treating them as we see them in the vehicle? Or is the vehicle on fire? We just need to get them out of there and get them to a safe area and then start triaging and treatment. So that's probably your first decisions there. The next thing we're going to look at is instant stabilization. So with that, we want to establish our command, so that way we all know who's in charge. A good team leader makes such a big difference. I don't know if anybody's done an MCI with I don't want to say bad, sorry, just a difficult, no incident command versus ones where you have an effective incident command. Huge difference. Organized versus chaos. Big difference for helping these patients. So the instant stabilization, part of that is we want to set objectives, strategies, and tactics on how we're going to deal with this. So we talk about management by objectives for the incident commander. So this is an approach used to communicate functional actions. So this can be accomplished through incident action planning process, which includes the following steps. So we're going to take a look at what's going on. So we're going to assess the incident situation. What exactly are we dealing with here? Is it just a vehicle accident? Is a car that went into a building? So now we have an unstable building and there's people inside the house that's hurt too. So we're going to take a look around at what we actually need for resources, what we need to make sure the scene is safe. I don't know if you noticed, there's a lot of repetition here. So I'm just trying to drive it home there. Stop, assess, make sure it's safe, look at what we're dealing with first, and get our resources lined up. Most important things, and that's probably why I brought it up 20 times through this whole presentation. So we're going to set some objectives. So the first thing is, what are we going to do? So what do we want to do first? Are we going to get the patients out, or are we going to stabilize first? What do we want to do with that? The next step is establish appropriate strategy or strategies to achieve objectives. How are you going to do it? Okay, we want to make sure the scene's stable, so we're going to put some cribbing underneath the car. We're going to stabilize, we're just going to get those people out of the house because it's not stable. We're going to figure out how we're going to make the scene safe. And we're going to perform tactical direction. So applying tactics appropriate to strategy, assigning the right resources and monitoring their performance. So obviously we're not going to get our EMS crews to start stabilizing cars. We're going to delegate that to fire. And also same thing with extrication. We're going to have EMS crews stand by ready to help these patients. So we're going to figure out what we need to do, how we're going to do it, and who is going to do it, and how we're going to effectively implement this plan. Okay. So when we create an action plan, every incident response must have an action plan. We need to, like I said, we need to figure out what we're going to do. So this can either be a verbal one where the incident commanders talk to each other, so fire and EMS and police, so they just talk it out, or it could actually be based on bigger ones. If you ever seen the ones where they actually have tents and everything set up and that actual incident command post, they might actually write down what their plan is and how they're going to deal with it. And again, for our region here, I'm sorry, I can't answer for all the regions, but that's where our disaster management team comes into place. Is they're the ones that can help organize and write down and make a bigger picture of everything with their incident command post. So we want to create an action plan. So no matter what level you're looking at, we need an action plan that has the 3 following elements. The first one is, what do we want to do? So, and of course, this is going to change based on the situation. So first it might be, what do we want to do? Let's make the scene safe so we can go help people. Once you've got the scene safe, okay, what now? What do we want to do? Do you want to just start pulling people? Do you want to start treating people in place? What are we doing? So of course, that's going to change. Who's responsible for doing it? So like I said, we want to stabilize the scene. Is it fire? Is it police? Is it a safety issue because there's possible guns on scene? So are we going to deal with the police, get the police to deal with that first? So what do you want to do? Take care of that active shooter for one. Who's responsible for doing that? I'm going to go with the police is responsible for that. So again, we have to have a dynamic plan here. And how do we communicate this all with each other? So, okay, so we're going to get fire to stabilize the scene. How do we know that they're done and it's stable and we can come in? We're going to go on interagency. Are you just going to come tell me? Is the captain going to come to me and I'll delegate my associates to wherever they need to go? We need to have that all put in place. Okay. So the what, who, and how. And this works really effectively. And as it progresses, your what, who, and how is going to change, but it's a good logical progression of how we're going to deal with things. Any questions about any of that? All right, carry on. So like I talked about before, there's different roles that might be put into place based on resources. So if you have multiple trucks and you have a lot of help and it's not just 2 of you on scene, we can start delegating people to certain specific jobs. So one of those is triage officer. So the triage officer is in charge of rapidly assessing and categorizing casualties. So this might also fall under the roles of the incident commander based on resources. I've been to quite a few MCIs, and honestly, as the incident commander, I've had to take this role as well, because if there's only 2 of you on scene, you're going to have to wear more than one hat. So this might be multiple jobs for you. So duties of the triage officer is to maintain a record of all casualties triage. So we want to make sure we keep track of who's who. So we've got, we've got a person over here, they're green, person over here that's red, person over here that's yellow. We want to make sure we're keeping track of what our levels of care are going to be. So we want to make sure each casualty is tagged with an appropriate casualty tag. I'm not going to lie, I'm bad at tagging patients. I just remember and try to bring them in as we can. But we want to make sure we're using our casualty tags. You should have those on your ambulances. Most people I find they're stuck like in the back corner shelf behind everything because we don't use them very often, but they're there for a reason. So we want to make sure we're bringing out our casualty tags. And we move triage casualties to appropriate treatment areas. So we'll talk about setting up treatment areas in a little bit here, but we want to make sure that we're not just sending everybody to the same area. There's specific areas we want. So again, with triage officer, you may have your incident commander and your triage officer, but your triage officer may also become your treatment officer depending on who's available. So you might have to double hat it where you're finding the patients, delegating what's wrong with them, and telling people what care this patient needs. Again, it's very fluid environment. So the treatment officer is in charge of the actual treatment of the patient. So they're overseeing all the EMS personnel. So you're going to tell them, okay, this person needs ALS, this person just needs some bandages, and delegate appropriately to which crews to deal with what. So one of those is establishing a treatment area. So when it comes to treatment areas, this is going to depend very much on what's going on in your area. We're going to get a little bit more specific into how to decide a treatment area later on, so we'll get to that. So we want to establish the equipment collection area. So it's whether everybody's just going to use this one ambulance and all the resources, all our trauma bags are going to go into that truck, or are we going to move a certain area? Is there a building we can use? And are we just going to offload our trucks and put all our equipment in this area first so everybody can have access to it? Or do we just want to keep our own equipment in our own ambulances? So we want to make sure that we're using our resources appropriately. You're going to monitor patients in the treatment as well. So obviously some people are going to get better with care. Some people are going to start getting worse no matter what we do. So we need to keep up to speed on what's going on, because that's going to affect our transport decisions and ongoing triage. So when we prioritize casualty transport in each category, so like I said, we want to talk, if we have a transportation officer, we want to talk back and forth about who needs to go first, which hospitals are going to need to go to, and that's part of the treatment officer, because you know what's actually going on with this patient better than anybody. So, and again, maintain communication with incident commanders. So give them a heads up. So if you've got 10 patients and your incident commander's like, where are we at? It's like, okay, we've got 5 patients, we've shut them off, but we've still got 5 here. If you can get us more ambulances, that'd be great. We need to have a back and forth conversation with that. So another one we have is a safety officer. This one I find is kind of one role that fire usually takes over. So that's been my personal experience. If you guys have other experiences, let me know. So with the safety officer, pretty straightforward. Their job is to make sure that everything stays safe. So they're actually going to oversee the operations and make sure that there's no new coming hazards, that we're not doing something that might be dangerous that we may not notice. So basically, they're just there as our safety support. That's their entire role, to make sure we're not going to a car that's going to flip over, make sure that we don't, there's actually aggressive patients, that we see that before it's too dangerous, things like that. And also the safety and casualty of casualties and bystanders, right? So I'm not going to go on a rant, but it's really frustrating when we're dealing with MCIs, especially in public, and people start coming in with their phones trying to take pictures and they have nothing to do with the scene. That can cause a lot of problems, because then we have to start asking, were you in this accident? What are you doing here? Things like that. So safety officer, and along with RCMP, things like that, can help try and keep the bystanders separate from what we're actually doing. So that way we can maintain a safe scene and keep a good track of all of our patients too. Okay. Another big one as well is decontamination. Again, this is more so fire's department, where if there is some kind of chemical agent, is it safe for us to be there? If they notice that there's possibly a chemical spill, they can tell us and bring everybody back. Make sure we decontaminate it appropriately, make sure we're taking proper precautions for any kind of chemical or anything like that as well. So that's kind of the roles of the safety officer. Realistically, safety on scene is everybody's responsibility, but the safety officer is more of a big picture safety versus we're definitely going to make sure the area we're working in is safe. Any questions about any of that? Awesome. So when we arrive on scene, again, we always want to make sure it's safe for ourselves. So there are some hazmat considerations. So there are some times where we're just not going to get to our patients. We're actually going to have to step back and wait. So I'm sure some people have been to car accidents where we want to get to our patient, we can't because the car they're in is so mangled. We have to wait for extrication. We need to back up, confined space, trench rescue, things like that. So another big one for us, especially with working rural, there's a lot of chemicals on farms, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. So there's always a chance for hazmat. So we always want to make sure we're checking, especially with MVCs, if there's a tanker on its side on the highway, we always want to check for certain things. So we want to make sure it's potential hazards. So fire, smoke, right? We may not want to run into a burning building, not usually recommended. So if there's any chemicals or hazardous materials, if we notice that there's a chemical truck on its side, we may want to make some phone calls before we jump out. Weather conditions. So again, is it really windy? Is it raining? What's going on? Because that can affect the distribution of a chemical as well. So if hazmat materials suspected confirmed present, reference your Canutech manual located in your ambulance. So everybody's got that nice orange book there that's supposed to be in your ambulance. You want to reference that. It's got the placards, it's got your care, what you need to do. And again, contact dispatch and let them know we have a hazardous material situation, because we don't want the fire department or the police showing up and we're sitting all calm in our ambulance and all of a sudden they walk into a hazmat scene. So give them a heads up. So we can look up in our Canutech manual or on our new phones that we got, the new iPhones. We have the app for this. So if you can't find your book because it got misplaced somehow, we can reference our care maps, our iPhones, and the app is actually on there. So we can look at what we're dealing with. So like I said, dispatch should be contacted and given an update. Location of hazardous materials. So where is it actually located? Is it in the middle of a busy highway? Is it behind a building? Like, where is it? Is there a bigger threat to a bigger community? Types and numbers of vehicles. So again, did a car hit a tanker truck sideways and it's leaking out everywhere, and we have people in multiple cars that are affected now? Identifying placards, signs, or significant markings on vehicles. Like I said, look at the tankers, look at what the chemical storage is, what placards are, reference your Canutech, and let dispatch know. Okay. So there is a number, and this is actually in the care maps, your shared health care maps for Manitoba Conservation Environmental Operations. So this number here is 24 hours. we are to contact this number, let dispatch know as well, or we can call them directly to tell them that we have a dangerous goods situation. They will send a specialized team to your scene. Another one as well is that if there's any nuclear issues, so if there's any radioactive material, there's not too many active nuclear power plants in our province, but there is still a chance that there's some nuclear material floating around. If you guys know of anywhere that uses nuclear energy, let me know. But there is actual specific, this is a federal number, so this again is 24 hours a day as well, and it's the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So if you have any concerns about nuclear material, we can call them and they can direct us. Any questions about that? All right. So I'm sure everybody's seen this at some point in their career. We're going to talk about the safety zones. So again, I'm sure for a lot of people this is reviews. So if we are dealing with a hazmat, again, same as everything, we do our assessment first. We don't just jump out, start grabbing people and helping them. So we have our different zones here. So the first one we're going to be dealing with is the actual hot zone. So the hot zone is the actual physical area where contamination is most likely to occur. So this is where the chemicals are, the radioactive material, whatever. This is where we can get injured. This is where we can actually have a brush of death because we're going to come in contact with the material. We want to stay out of this zone unless we're wearing the appropriate protective equipment. Okay. So with that, we must follow procedures. Again, I find like EMS, this isn't our realm. We're not going to go in there and make the scene safe. We're not going to go in there and contain chemicals. That would be more so fires. So we want to work closely with fire and talk about their policies, how they want to go with it, and how we're going to enter, how we're going to look after patients, how we're going to decontaminate. We really need to work together on this one here. So just as a little trivia there, so maybe turn the initial isolation zone. So that's the area where we don't want anybody going in. So if you ever hear that term, that's what it means. Like we're just going to stay out of that area until it's deemed safe, or we're just not going to go in at all and let other people deal with it. The next zone we have is the warm zone. So this is more of a controlled zone. It's kind of the corridor between the cold zone and the hot zone. So in here, in this area here, we're going to do our decontamination. We're going to get equipment going back and forth. And a big thing as well is it may affect our ability to triage. So if we're only able to triage patients as they're decontaminated and taken out of the zone, we may have to really look at how we treat our patients a little differently. So we're going to have a little bit more of a dynamic triage with this, because if they all need decontaminated, it's just whoever gets decontaminated first gets triaged. So we have to be very fluid with our triage of these patients. The cold zone, so this is the outermost part. So ideally this is where incident command is. Your on-scene commander should be here, because obviously we don't want to be in the hot zone. We can't really run things when we're wearing full biohazard suits or anything like that. So we want to make sure we stay out of this out of the hot zone, so we stay in the cold zone. So in this one, just our regular clothes should work. We don't need extensive PPE. We don't need to wear special suits. We can just work on our own, in our own uniforms here. So with this, we want to restrict traffic, though. We don't want everybody just going in and out the cold zone, because we do want to make sure we're containing the environment as much as possible. And the big thing is with this, with the hot, cold, and warm zones, it's going to be very geographical. So your hot zone may be very large, so your warm zone is going to be large, and then your cold zone might be even bigger. Or it might just be very specific access points where it's inside a facility or a building where there's a chemical spill. So your cold zone might be outside the building, your warm zone is the entrance and exit to the building, and your hot zone is the actual inside of the building. So it can be totally dependent on the situation. So we're going to work with fire and make sure that we have these designated areas. And as incident commander, we're going to make sure everybody's aware of it. It's like, don't go in the building. It's not safe. Make sure everybody's aware of it. Again, that's part of the safety officer's job as well, to make sure everybody's aware of what's safe, what's not safe, where we can work, where we can't work, and where we want to stay away from. So any potentially contaminated personnel, clothing, equipment, samples should not be in the cold zone. So anything contaminated or potential contamination, that stays in the warm zone. It does not come to the cold zone. We should not be worried about any contamination of chemicals, radioactive material, anything like that entering the cold zone. Any questions about any of that? It's a lot of info. So when it comes to our case study, so we're going back to our case study here. So originally we were dispatched to MVC, possible 6 patients with possible pediatrics. We talked a bit about what resource we'd want right away. And when we first hear the page, we'd radio in, we'd notify the hospitals, ask for extra resources, all that good stuff there. So going back to our case study here. So you arrive on scene and you have an eyewitness tell you that there's a report of a car speeding around a corner. So they came around the corner going exponentially fast, and they tried to swerve. There's two people on bicycles that were at the other side of the corner. When they came around, they saw them. They tried to swerve to miss them. They failed. They hit the two people on bicycles, and they themselves ended up wrapping their car around a tree. Okay. So there are two casualties. When you pull up, you see there are two casualties actively on the road, and there are 4 people in the car still. So before we start getting into treatment, things like that, just for everybody here, so when you arrive on scene, you see this, what would be some of our first steps? Don't be shy.
Consider your first steps, right? Your gas, glass, fire, wire. Right?
Awesome.
Our safety.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure, right? Safety first, right? So before we even jump out, we're going to take a look around the scene, see what's going on. If there's that debris field, they hit a tree, but did they hit anything else on the way? Are they leaking fuel everywhere? So awesome. Yeah. So scene safety, always the biggest thing. Check for that. What else? So as per the scenario, there's just 2 of you. You just showed up. So there's 2 of you in an ambulance, and you come across and you see all this. What's next?
You'd be calling dispatch to give a report of what you're actually seeing on scene. You'd
Okay, yeah,
also
for
be
sure.
going and checking your patients. Okay, so you might have 6 people, but how are they? Is anybody walking around? You
Yeah,
already
so
have fire on arriving because we've already notified them.
It's awesome, right? So get another good look at the scene, see what we have available, see how many people there are. Is fire on scene? Can they help with secure the scene, take care of any issues? And contact dispatch and say, hey, where's my fire at? You know, do we have any other ambulances coming? Where are they at? Big thing we have to keep in remember is when we were talking about before, we have to establish incident command. I know this may not seem like an MCI, but when there's 2 of you there and there's 6 patients, that's an MCI. So you have multiple patients, you don't know what's really going on. So you need to delegate yourself as incident commander. Once you're incident commander, again, then we're going to contact dispatch, make sure they're aware of our unit number and who we are, and we're taking control of the scene. And then we can start looking at our resources. We can start looking at where are our patients, how many are there. Do we want to start treating our patients right away? What do you think?
Well, you want to see what you have first, so you're not going to treat them, but you're going to check going by your triage.
Right, awesome. Yeah, we're not just going to start grabbing people and dragging them out of cars and stuff, right? So we're going to do some triage. So we want to look, we want to find everybody first, and we want to triage our patients. So identify yourself as incident commander, talk with your partner, delegate your roles. If they're going to be triage, if you're going to do it as incident commander, where's my other resources? We're going to work with fire department. So all that good stuff about being on scene first, we're going to take care of first before we actually start treating patients. Yeah, awesome. So somebody just put assume command and start triage. Perfect. So when we start triage, we're not going to start treating patients. We just want to see make sure we have everybody. Okay. So just as a side note for this scenario, I actually made it take place in the town of Stony Mountain. That's just in my area, so I know the town. So this is actually just a bit of a picture of what your scene's looking like. So they were coming around the corner really fast on Maple Drive there towards School Road. There was a couple patients on bicycles off that gravel road there, and as the car came around the corner, it hit the 2 cyclists, and they ended up wrapping their car around the tree in front of that house there. So that's kind of getting an idea of the picture of the layout. So again, as on-scene commander, we want to take a look at what we're dealing with for the area we're dealing with, because when we look at this area, what are some considerations we're going to have to make for oncoming resources?
We have the entrance and exit ways, but with having a child care center there, you also want to make sure you want to also be able to block off the roads that people are not going to be interfering with any treatment and any other vehicles coming in for emergencies.
Perfect, right? So we're right on a corner there. So that's a really good point of bringing. We want to make sure people aren't driving through, because if someone's just going for a drive, don't know what's there, and then come around that corner like the first car did, we could have some other issues. I got one point here, it says 360-degree scene check. Awesome, right? We want to make sure we have everybody. We want to see what's going around the area. Another thing as well is just, I picked this corner too, because when you look at the roads, you've got your egress routes. So how do we want to approach it and how do we want to leave? Because these are, in the town of Stony Mountain, they have very narrow roads. It's an older town. So it's very easy to block these roads. I've done like house fires and stuff in this town, and it's very easy to block off roads. So do we want to have a specific entryway? Do we want to have a specific exit way? Because you can see here, it's basically there's 2 ways in, 2 ways out, but we're only going to be accessed one at a time. This gravel road here doesn't go anywhere. It just leads to a field. So that's not really going to be a good exit route for us. So we have to look at that too. So how do I want people to approach? Where do I want to go? One nice thing is, and like I said, I've done a calls in this area, is that baseball diamond there, the helicopter can land there. So that's something to look at as well. Where can we land the helicopters? So we're probably going to want stars for this one because we have this many people. And if anybody's not familiar with where Stony Mountain is, I'm sure not everybody knows every town in the province. So just I have a little map here so that where the red dot is, that's Stony Mountain. We're just north of Winnipeg. So I Google mapped it. I've driven it. It takes about 26 minutes to get from Stony Mountain going red to HSC. So you've got a good response time towards the city from this location. So we could look at helicopters, resources, things like that. So where do we want people to drive in? Where do we want the helicopter to land? And as incident commander, this is stuff we're going to have to look at because as our resources start showing up, we don't want that bottlenecking. We don't want people getting stuck. We want to make sure we're getting our patients taken care of appropriately. So all these are all things we think about before we even start dealing with patients. We need to figure out where our resources are going. Does anybody have any other comments, concerns, questions? Awesome. So it was mentioned that we're going to get there. We're going to check our scene, make sure everything's good. Scene safety, absolutely. We're going to see how many patients we have. We're going to look at where our resources can go. We're going to see what resources are coming. We're going to declare ourselves on-scene commanders. That way dispatch knows who to talk to. And then our next step would be triage, and that was brought up. So with triage, and again, this is a little difficult to do when you have very injured people. Their level of care is actually going to be diminished when we do triage. So we always want to give good quality patient care. That's not, I'm saying we don't not want to give good care, but we need to make sure we have all our patients. We need to make sure that we're checking all our patients, and we need to make sure that we're finding all our patients. So especially with dynamic incidents, so when you've got people spread over a big area, we need to find everybody, because if I have like 6 green people here, but the 1 red patient's in the trees over there, I need to find them and deal with them appropriately. So we need to find all our patients, and we're just going to basically get an idea of where are they at, how are my patients doing, and then we can start treating once we decide what level they are, and we're going to go into that in a minute. So realistically, when you're doing triage, you can intervene and deal with immediate life threats. So if they've got an obvious bleed, we can tourniquet right away if you have one available, but we're going to not do full patient care. We're just going to quickly see what we have. Like I said, we don't want to start doing super immersion care because someone else may die because we're not finding them. So if we come across our first patient in their cardiac arrest and we start doing our full ACLS code there, meanwhile you got the guy bleeding to death in the car, that's not really going to work for us. So we are going to lower care in that sense, where we don't want to get completely sidetracked by this really sick looking individual. We want to make sure we find everybody first. And not to put down anybody's care, but this is something that we're kind of lacking in as well. It's very easy to get distracted by someone that looks really messed up. We need to make sure we check for everybody, not just the worst looking patient. Okay. So any delay in obtaining casualty count negatively impacts all patients. So you might have someone that looks really bad now, but 2 feet away, there's someone that's even worse, but we're so distracted by this first person, they're not getting care. So again, we need to find everybody before we actually start providing care. So we mentioned the role of the triage officer before. So again, this might be a double role of the incident commander and the triage officer. Incident commander to become the triage officer as well. So with that, it's based on the amount of incidents, people available on the incident. So determines location of the triage area. So depending on what the scene is, sometimes you might triage the person in place. Sometimes you might need to just get the patients out and to a certain area where you can actually triage them. So if you have multiple vehicles that are crashed into each other, you may have trouble triaging them based on the environment. So we may just want to extricate them, bring to a specific triage area and assess our patients. Things like house fires for sure. If fire is just pulling people out of a building, let's just all get into a safe area and we can triage them in that safe area. I'm obviously not going to triage patients in a burning building. That's not going to make a lot of sense. So we want to bring them to a controlled environment, to a specific triage scene. So the triage person officer also makes sure the area is safe for personnel to enter before beginning triage. So again, safety, safety, safety. We don't want to be doing triage in a big debris field, so we want to try and find somewhere safe. If that's inside an ambulance, great. And again, we have to keep those MCI multipliers in account. So if it's -50 outside, we're not going to do that nice thing where we set up a big tarp in the field because people are going to freeze to death. So maybe it's, you know what, let's just get people in the trucks. We'll triage them as they come through. We'll send them to other trucks and try to keep them warm. We've done MCIs where we use the fire trucks, the rescue trucks. They have more room in the back. So we've done that too as we triage patients. If you actually have enough people on scene, and I've used fire for this as well, is you may start triage teams. So with that, you're going to delegate people to actually form a team of like 3, max 7, and they're actually going to go out and do this straight line and actually go and start triaging people and just find everybody. This works really well in dynamic scenes because that way you make sure you don't miss anybody. Done this on a few car accidents where we think we've got everybody, but we're not sure. We want to make sure. And so we set up those lines and we go searching for patients. Okay. And big thing is communication. So if you have a specific triage officer as opposed to just the incident commander dealing with it, they need to be in that constant contact with the incident commander. It's like, okay, we have 3 people over here, we found 2 over here, and that way we can keep up to date with dispatch of how many patients we have. Okay, so ongoing reports are super important. So when it comes to dealing with triage, we're going to use the process of global sorting. So global sorting helps to effectively assess, administer life-saving interventions, again, just immediate stuff, and ultimately treat and transport patients. So our first step is we're going to use a public address system or loudspeaker. So those loudspeakers we have on the ambulance, they're not just for bugging people as they walk in front of you. They actually have a purpose. So we can use that to direct everybody to start walking towards us, because the first thing we want to do is get them out of the area. So if you have people that we can quickly get to the safe area, we're going to delegate them that. So if you can yell really loud, you can do that too. We have loudspeakers so we can direct people. But the big thing we want to do first is we want to sort the walkers, the wavers, and the still. So we're going to break down our patients into these 3 groups. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to give direct, simple, loud, and clear visual verbal commands. So we're going to say, anybody that can walk, we need you to come over to this safe area over here. And we'll have people wave them in, have a specifically very obvious designated area. Because our first group, the walkers, so these are walking wounded. So those who are able to obey commands, leave the scene, walk to that certain area, usually only have minor injuries. People don't tend to walk to an area if their leg's broken in half. So these ones that are able to get up and move, these are probably going to be our lower acuity patients because they can obey commands, they can walk, they can move to a certain specific area. So we want them to get them to the triage area. The other thing as well to keep in mind is that because they can walk, they may assist other people that are more severely injured walk to the triage area. Completely fine. Don't say, hey, you're too hurt, you can't walk yet. Let them come to the triage area. That's awesome. But we want to get those people out of the way first because those are probably more lower acute patients. The next ones we have are the wavers. So these are patients that can possibly follow commands, but they can't get up and move. So we're going to ask them that they wave at us, they lift up a leg, an arm, just like, I'm here, help me, I'm here. So those are our wavers. So these ones, they're not as high acuity as patients that are unresponsive, but they're definitely not as good as the walkers because they can't move. A thing to remember with waivers is that some people may be able to walk, but they're staying with their loved ones or an injured friend, and they don't want to walk away from their patients. So you may have walkers that stay in your waiver category as well. So this is just a very general way to help break down who's who. Then with the walkers, so we delegate, we send our triage people to go check on them, and we also have our still. Okay, so these are patients that do not respond at all. So if you have a patient that you're giving directions to, they walk to you, they wave to you, or if they don't do anything, the patients that are just laying there not doing anything, those are probably going to be our high acuity patients. So this is just a very quick way to break down which patients you think are going to need to be triaged, in what order. Any questions about that? And if everybody's just unconscious on the ground, that's a bad day at work. So carrying out global sorting here. So dealing with large MCI, divide the scene into separate areas and delegate responders to an area of responsibility. So if we are dealing with dynamic scenes, we may have incidents all over the place. So we still want to do the walkers, wavers, and stills. So we got our walkers out of the way, but we have our wavers and our stills. So we want to designate certain areas. So we'll say, okay, so if we have enough people, we can break them up into teams. We can break them up into teams, and we can give them specific areas. Again, casualty sweeps are important. So it's like, okay, team A, you're going to take this side. Team B, you're going to take this side. Team C, we're going to check you here. The other thing is that if it's an MVC with multiple cars, you may just delegate, okay, you're going to take the blue truck, you're going to take the red car, you're going to check the people in the yellow car, and designate your people to check them in specific areas. Okay. Like I said before, you could do the straight line triage. And what's going to happen is if you just do that straight line triage through an area, people are going to walk through and triage as they find people. So, and this can be difficult because you have really injured patients. We need to keep moving forward. We can't stop and start giving care. And again, it's easier said than done. It's not the funnest thing to do, is that when you have someone who's really injured, they're asking you for help and you're like, you're yellow, and you carry on. But we need to make sure we're checking everybody. So by doing that nice straight line with that specific areas, it helps us find everybody and delegate everybody appropriately. So we just keep going, and as we come across people, we triage as we come across people. Okay. Again, this is something that's a lot easier said than done. If we just start running towards the worst looking patients, we're going to miss stuff. And that's why it's nice to do this organized triage fashion where we just sweep the area and triage as we go. Because as we go from patient to patient to patient, that makes sure we don't miss anybody and everybody's triaged appropriately. Because if I find my first patient's really injured and I stop to give them care, the 4 patients past them aren't going to get the proper care. So we need to make sure we're doing organized triage. So how do we actually do the triage? So we use Start Triage. This is actually what dispatch uses over the phone as well. When they start getting calls for possible MCIs, they'll use Start Triage as well. So this is the most widely used triage system in North America for MCIs. Okay. So in Start, victims are grouped in 4 categories depending on their urgency or their need of evacuation. So in our actual care maps under shared health, so if we have under A03 general mass casualty incident, we have the Start Triage algorithm here. So we're going to go over it here, and how do we actually triage our patient to decide how to label each of our patients. So the first step is we're going to determine the severity by conducting 3 simple tests. So in order to remember what test we're going to use, you remember the acronym RPM. So that's going to delegate what 3 things we're checking on our patient. The first thing is respiratory rate. So we're going to look at respiratory rate because rapid breathing is, especially with trauma, it's an indicator of trauma to the chest or lungs. It causes the lungs to work hard to get oxygen, shock, we're going to breathe faster, things like that. So just looking at respiratory rate is going to affect how we triage our patients. So when we look at the beginning of our Start Triage here, so if they're able to walk, talk, and everything, they get labeled as green. We check our respiratory rate. And are they breathing? Yes. Then we go to respiratory rate is greater than 30 per minute. Yes or no. Okay, and then we're going to triage appropriately. So if they're over 30 breaths per minute, they fail the respiration rate, their respiration test. So that's not great. So the next step is we're going to check perfusion. So with that, we're going to check their radial. If their radial pulse cannot be felt, their cap refill is greater than 2 seconds, or their systolic BP is lower than 80, they failed a perfusion test. So if we find any major hemorrhages when we get there, obviously we're not going to go, sorry, I have to triage our people, just try not to bleed too much. We can tourniquet it, we can put direct pressure on, but we need to keep going with triage. So we can do immediate life-saving interventions, but we do need to make sure we keep checking, because if the next patient is bleeding severely as well, we need to get to that. And that's where it's nice having the tourniquets, where we can just tourniquet a limb and carry on with our triage. So with this here, if we look at their respiratory rate, then we look at their cap refill or their distal pulses, and if it is absent, we're going to go one way, and if it's present, we're going to go next. If anybody has any questions anytime, feel free to bring them up. So the next thing in RPM, we have our mental test. So with that, a patient that is unable to follow a simple command likely has trauma to the head and could have a serious brain injury or swelling in the brain. So we can ask them to perform a simple task. So we check their breathing rate, see if we got distal pulses, and we say, what's your name? And if they're just looking at you all spaced out, that's not too good. If they can open their mouth, squeeze their fingers, open their eyes, things like that, if they actually obey commands. So when it comes down to your triage here, so according to here, so if you have a respiratory rate greater than 30 minutes, yes, they're red. If they have a cap refill is greater than 2 seconds, distal pulses are absent, or systolic blood pressure less than 80, they're red. If they fail to respond to commands, they are red. If all 3 of those are within normal ranges, they are yellow. Okay, because again, they can't walk. So if for some reason they can't walk due to injury, they're yellow. Okay. If they fail any one of these 3 tests, they become red. Any questions about that? And again, this is all in your care map, so if you want to follow along in your apps, feel free to. Okay. So if the patient fails any, like I said, any of the 3 in the immediate category and are tagged red. So as we're going through our triage, if you've got all 3 of those, they get that triage tag that says red. Okay. If any patient has worse injuries preventing them from walking or moving, but pass all 3 of those tests, they are tagged as yellow. So on your triage tag, which we're going to talk more about in a minute, we're going to tag them as yellow. So expectant patients are determined by their inability to breathe on their own. Okay. So with expectants, so usually we call these like the black, labeling them as black. So when a patient with no respiration is encountered, a head tilt is used to position the airway. So if we come across a patient that is not actively breathing, we're going to put them in a head tilt chin lift, see if we can open up their airway that way. So with that, we try to open up the airway. So we look on this side of the algorithm here. So are they breathing? No. Head tilt chin lift, open the airway. Are they breathing? No. They're put in the expectant category, tagged as black. If the answer is yes, then they go red. We don't want to stop doing triage. We get these patients are in extreme state. So what would be recommended is that if you need to continue doing your triage and you have to leave them, tag them appropriately, put them in the recovery position to keep their airway open, then carry on with your triage. Just as a little side note here, I've been doing some online studies through the States, and they actually were talking about removing the black category, and they were going to make it like zebra with black and white stripes as opposed to black, because it was actually an incident in the States where they had a massive MCI. And the on-scene commander on open air said, we're not going to treat these 6 patients. They're all black. And that did not go over well when the media found it, because they were thinking that they weren't going to treat the patients because of their ethnicity. So they are really looking at, they don't want to have issues like that because it's already stressful enough to deal with these scenes. So they're looking at changing it from a black to a zebra category. I don't know exactly what they're looking at, but that's something that's come up. So with triage, with patients that are in the expected category and have been tagged with a black tag, they are in the expectant, so they're probably going to be our lowest priority patients. Okay. Any questions about that? Awesome. So the next one as well we have in our care maps here is Jumpstart. So this is for pediatric patients. So depending on what book you read, sometimes they have different ages. Depending on their guideline, they have different ages of when to start using the Jumpstart triage. For what we're doing in shared health, it's usually used for patients under 100 pounds or under the age of 10, or a suspected patient under the age of 10. So sometimes it's hard to gauge age of kids just by looking at them. There's some really big 10-year-olds, there's some really small 10-year-olds, depending on them. So if you expect them to be 10 or under, then we would use the Jumpstart triage. So it's very similar to the START triage we just used for adults, but there's going to be some variations based on their age. So when we use Jumpstart, again, children, not just little adults, we probably talked about that lots before. So we need to have a bit of a different triage approach to them. So when it comes to actually triaging children, over triage of children can easily happen. Especially if care providers have children at home, it's going to affect how you look at these sick children. So they can be over triaged due to the actual patient themselves. They're crying, they're very worked up, their breathing rate can be a lot faster because they're scared. So that can affect our triage. And also, like I said, the care provider. So you get that maternal instinct kicking in. It's like, oh, this reminds me of a kid at home. It's going to affect you personally. And you may say, you know what, it's a sick kid. They're red. All the kids are red. We need to get the kids out of here. They're sick. So we need to really triage these patients effectively and not over triage, because then we're going to not give appropriate care and they may not go to the proper facilities for treatment either. So on the flip side, there's also potential for under triage. There's also potential for under triage because statistically kids handle shock a lot better than adults do. So they may look okay, but they're not. So we may say, well, you know what, you're good, you're awake, your skin looks pink, you're going to be a green for now. So we need to make sure we do a proper assessment on kids. So the first step is when the triage officer instructs all who can walk to move to a designated area. So our triage doesn't really change too drastically. So we're going to do our walkers, waivers, and still, but when there's kids involved, it's going to change it a bit here. So you have an injured baby, they're not going to walk to you whether they're fine or they're not, right? So we need to kind of look at it a little differently. So things that might affect ambulation for children. So obviously kids that can't walk yet, they don't understand your commands, they're not going to walk to you. Okay, so something to keep in mind there. So that's why we still need to check vehicles for kids in car seats, things like that. We still need to do an area sweep because these kids are not going to come when you call them. So there may be children with developmental delays. They just don't understand your commands. And again, that depends on the developmental age of the child as well. They may not understand what's going on. They may just be standing there crying. They may not respond to your commands appropriately. So, children with acute injuries which prevented them from walking before the incident. So if they have any kind of inabilities, so they can't walk to start with, they have difficulties walking, things like that, that might just mean they can't walk. And with that as well, the other thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to this with the walkers, wavers, and still, sometimes kids will be very hurt, but they'll be carried by their parents. So they've kind of gone into the walker category because their parents carried them. So we still need to make sure we're checking those children appropriately because the kid might be unresponsive, unable to walk themselves, and the parents might carry them out. So that might change our triage for that as well. So respiratory considerations for children. So with children, there's what they termed as a window of salvageability, in which a patient is apneic, but circulation is still present because the heart muscle hasn't become hypoxic enough to stop yet. So because of anatomical, physiological reasons, so with kids, they have weaker intercostal muscles, smaller airways, they can become apneic very quickly as opposed to adults. They stop breathing and become apneic, circulation is going to stop as well. So we want to just make sure we're taking some respiratory things into consideration here. So it is during the time of salvageability that airway clearance and a trial of ventilations may stimulate spontaneous breathing. So I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm getting texts here. I think people are delayed because I'm getting answers for questions for the last section. So I appreciate you guys answering it. It's just, I think there's a delay because I'm getting stuff for, I would arrive on scene and establish command right away. Awesome, but that was probably for the scenario. So I recognize you're jumping in. I appreciate that. But going on here, so we want to make sure that we try to get these kids breathing right away because that's probably the best that we can do for them. So as we start, we're triaging, we're going to look for spontaneous respiration. You all good there? If you turn your microphone on, you need to turn off and getting a lot of feedback. All right, thank you. So respiratory considerations here. So if respirations are present, we're going to assess the rate. So with the start here, we take into account the parameters for the breathing rate of children. So parameters of 15 to 45. So less than 15, greater than 45. Because kids just naturally have a faster respiratory rate. So we want to take that in consideration. So when we look at our pediatric algorithm here, so if a child's apneic, so if we go down there, so we do the, are they green? They're walking to you. Awesome. We'll send them to triage, not the highest priority people to check. Are they breathing? We look at no. If they're not breathing, we open up their airways. So again, just a head tilt, chin lift, draw thrust, and we check for a pulse. So those are peripheral pulses are given jump start. So this is where the whole jump start thing comes in for kids. We're going to give them 5 ventilations. So again, with adults, we said if they're in respiratory cardiac arrest, we're not going to start CPR. But with kids, again, because they have that window of salvageability, we're going to try and give them some rescue breaths. So we're going to give them 5 rescue breaths while head tilt chin lift and see how they do. If they start breathing again, that's great. They become red. If they don't start breathing again, they become expectant and go in the black category. So with circulatory considerations for jumpstart triage, so we're going to assess perfusion on the breathing patient by palpating peripheral pulses on injured limbs. So with adults, we use blood pressure, distal pulses, cap refill. Excuse me, for these patients, we're just checking pulses. So depending on the age of the child, we may check radial, we may check brachial, maybe femoral, but we're actually going to check our distal pulses. So as we go down here, we did our breathing check. So if they are breathing, we're going to carry down. We're going to look at our respiratory rate. Is it equal to 15 or 45? If it's no, if they're below 15 or greater than 45, they go to red. If they are within that category, we're going to check for our pulse. And if the pulse is present distally, they are red. If they don't have any pulse, not breathing, even after a 5, they become expectant. If they do have a pulse, though, we're going to move on with a neural check after that. Okay. So things to take in consideration for children with neurological. Okay. So we use the AVPU. With adults, we use the can you obey commands. Can you open your mouth? Can you open your eyes? Squeeze my fingers? Whatever you want to choose to do for that. But obviously, you know, baby that's 1.5 years old, they're not going to really understand your commands. So we're going to stick with AVPU to determine the neural response there. Okay. So patient with response from alert to appropriate response to pain. So localization, withdrawal, they react to pain. They are deemed as protecting their own airway and they're yellow. If they do not have a response to pain, then they're put into the red. Or if they have an inappropriate. Okay. So again, if they start having some different posturing that isn't appropriate, so instead of withdrawing from pain, they start doing the cerebral posturing, things like that, we're going to put them into the red category. Okay. Any questions about that? So that's start triage and jumpstart triage. And again, it seems like a lot of steps, and it seems kind of like a harsh way to determine if someone's going to survive or not. But again, if we're looking at big picture items where we have 20 people injured and only 4 paramedics, triage is super important. We want to try and save as many people as we can. And the really tough part about these is making those difficult decisions. So it's not a fun thing to do. I've been there, I've done it. It's hard, but it's something we need to do to try to save as many people as we can. Okay. Any questions at all about triage? So some triage special considerations. So chemical injuries. So there's actually no specific pre-hospital triage system specifically to deal with chemical injuries because lots of different chemicals are going to affect people very differently. But it's definitely, again, safety first. We want to make sure we are safe first. We're dealing with the injury, setting up that hot zone, cool zone, warm zone, things like that. And we want to make sure that we're checking that mostly respiratory for chemical injuries. Okay. So we want to look at things such as degree of salivation, secretions, or seizures in cholinergic and nerve agent poisoning. That could affect our triage because if there's lots of that salivation, lacrimation, urination, all that good sludge mnemonic there, if someone's having a lot of that reactions like nonstop emesis, as long as their airway's protected, honestly, that doesn't really affect our triage. If they're still breathing okay, if they've still got distal pulses, if they're still able to obey commands, if the chemical's making them vomit a lot, it sucks. It looks dramatic, but as per triage, it's not going to change their categories. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So it's really, we're going to have to modify it based on what we're finding for our patients. Okay. One thing I actually found that was interesting when I was doing the research for this is that children can actually get affected more because honestly, they're just shorter. They're closer to the ground. If anybody's ever seen a cloud of ammonium hydroxide, if you haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. It's really creepy. It's literally just a cloud that creeps across the ground. So if you have a child in there, they're going to get the full exposure of it. So we kind of really have to look after kids and make sure that they're decontaminated appropriately. Okay. And of course, like I said before, we might only be able to triage patients as they are actively getting decontaminated. I'm not going to go in the whole procedure of decontamination. I'm not too familiar with it. So we'll just do the best we can with what we've got. So someone brought up explosions. So with blast injuries, so when we go to blast scenes, and it was mentioned before by someone in the chat there that when there's one blast, we always have to be careful of a second blast, whether potentially on purpose, so it's been set as a booby trap, or if just secondary explosions because of the nature of the explosion. So if there's lots of flammable chemicals, if it's a propane truck that's on its side, and there's a chance there could be more explosions, things like that. So we always want to make sure scene is safe. So with that, it's really going to be hard to assess mental status on these patients when we do our triage because with blast injuries, they may have eardrum damage and they may not be able to hear. So when we do the walker's waiver still, we say everybody that can walk, come towards us. They just may not hear you. They'll have that tinnitus. They'll just hear and have that ringing in the ear. They may have ruptured their eardrums and they just physically can't hear you. So that's something to keep in mind. So they might just be staggered around, confused and dazed. So penetrating wounds from shrapnel can be very subtle. So hopefully no one's seen a lot of explosions in their time, but when like an aerosol can or something like that, like little tiny chunks of metal going into their body can just pepper them, and it may not bleed a lot, and it may be very hard to tell. So we have to keep that in mind, that there may be secondary injuries. Yeah. So extremity wounds can be graphic or life-threatening. So I used to work with the Red Cross on their landmine awareness program and work with people overseas on dealing with extrication of patients from landmines. I worked in Cambodia as well with the mines group there, training people on how to do mine extrication and treatment of patients with limbs blown off. And it's pretty graphic. When these people get their limbs blown off, it is very distracting. So, but the thing is, again, triage. We still need to make sure we're doing triage. If someone does have a limb blown off, we want to tourniquet it, get them to the triage area or the safe area, and then continue on with our triage as best we can. Again, it sounds kind of cold to say it, but we just need to deal with the immediate life threat and carry on, because there might be someone worse off down the line, or we just need to make sure we have everybody. So stabilize them as best you can, tourniquet it, dress it, anything you can do, and get them out of the scene and carry on with your triage. Okay. So all people in the blast area are at risk for concussions and lung tissue damage regardless of initial symptoms. So some of these may not show immediately. So just the shock wave, you get the tertiary where people get blown up, they get hit with shrapnel, they get thrown, they land. There's a lot of different things that can happen with explosions. So realistically though, statistically, if someone has a GCS of 3 after a blast injury, usually that's not a good sign. Okay, so usually there's some associated head injury with that. So again, triage appropriately, but just keep in mind there's some things that's going to make this a little bit worse than just your regular vehicle rollover. So burn injuries, my personal least favorite thing to deal with. I hate dealing with burns. That's just me. So these can cause a lot of issues with triage as well. So the patient suffering and graphic nature of the injuries can result in over triage. If someone has a severe burn to their arm, it's graphic, they're screaming in pain, it looks horrible, it smells even worse. But realistically in our triage, if they're awake, they're talking, they're able to move, they've got distal circulation, they're in a lower category. Even though it hurts a lot and it's painful, when it comes to triage, they may actually triage as yellow or green based on the big picture of it. So when you see someone that's got severe burns, it's easy to say, wow, that patient's in a lot of pain. There's a lot of potential for issues here. You're red. But again, we have to keep with that RPM to give us our initial triage. And there's absolutely nothing going back with re-triaging people, but that initial triage is just who can we save? Okay. So burns are often overestimated by providers with less experience, or underestimated as well when performed too early. So we get those heat injuries, they may not show right away. So especially inhalation injuries. We had one when I was in the military. There was a guy that was in a bison, and he actually got hit with an RPG, and the RPG didn't kill him. It was actually the heat from the explosion that went into their bison when they closed the turret, closed the lid on the bison, and they actually breathed in all the hot gases from the explosion. He ended up dying a few days later in Germany because of the inhalation burns. So it may not happen right away, but that's definitely something we have to keep in mind with blast injuries and with burns. Just that thermal injuries, the carbon monoxide problems, things like that. When more specifically with burns, they may take a while to show. So big picture, again, MCI, mechanism injury, we have to take that all in consideration. Any questions about triage? And I do see that you guys are putting stuff in the chat, and like I said, that's awesome. So I think there's a bit of a delay because I still have people answering stuff from earlier sections. So I appreciate you putting in your 2 cents there. That's great. So I apologize if I'm not acknowledging you when we're going through the section there. Like I said, there is a delay. So if at any point there's any questions, feel free to put it in there. As they pop up, I'll answer them, even if it's from previous sections. Okay. So our actual triage tags. We should have these on all of our ambulances. They may differ based on your region. I'm not 100% sure if everybody uses the same tags. If you use something different than these, let me know. This is what our region, the RHA, uses. So this is what I talked with our disaster management about. So we use these tags, and again, this color coding system, so this is designed to work with our start. So we have green, yellow, red, or black based on our patient determinant. So with the MET tag, So tags need to be placed in a visible location on the patient, either the wrist or the ankle. So based on if they're walking, we put it on their wrist. If they're laying on their ankle or their wrist, don't put it on clothing. Don't put it on their jacket zipper, things like that, because if we need to start doing trauma assessments and we start cutting clothes away, we can lose their tag. So it needs to be actually attached to the patient. So like this patient here, they've actually got it attached to his wrist. Even though they've got all the extra stuff on him, it's going to stay on his body so we know what's going on with him. So identify the priority using the color bars at the bottom of the tag. So obviously if they're red, we're going to pull off the green and yellow, and that's going to tag them as red. So if they actually start getting better, so if we take them to a treatment area and they actually become a lower acuity, don't take a piece of tape and tape the yellow back on. Just make sure that the treatment officer is aware of it, that they originally tagged red and things have changed now. Okay. So on the tags, mark the tags with information critical to the survival, to their survival, such as injury locations, vital signs on the back of the tag there. So it's got both sides there. So we're just writing pertinent information. We're not going to be doing PCRs at this point. At this point, it's just triage, write down what the injuries are, what level you triage them at, and get them to the treatment area or to a more definitive triage area. So the treatment officer, transport officer retains, so when it comes to the tag, we'll talk more about transport in a little bit. When it comes to the actual tags here, so as you can see, the corners removed. So when this patient is transported, we tear off the little corner that showed ambulance, and then that way the triage, transport, instant commander, whoever holds onto those. If we had 20 patients, once everybody's gone, we should have 20 little corners of ambulance pictures. That way we know we have every single person because we've checked every single tag. That's what those pictures are there for. They're not just there for extra pictures to have. So that way we can do an accurate head count. So if we are getting ready to leave scene and it's like, well, I only have 18 ambulance corners, but we had 20 patients, what happened to those other 2? So that we can actually check. So once we're actually completed triage, what do we do? We're going to make sure all, like I said, all patients are appropriately triaged and determine the number of patients and their condition. And we're going to do a final sweep. So if we think we've got everybody, do one more final sweep, because it would be really terrible to leave with our 20 patients and find out there was 21. Always make sure to do a full sweep of the area. Want to make sure that if we are in the treatment transport area, that we let the incident command know. It's like, yeah, we've got everybody. We've all assigned them transport. We've treated the best we can. We're going to start moving people out, because then that'll start shifting resources to different areas, or we can start actually releasing resources as well. So triage tags will initially just be the only form of EMS documentation, like I said. So we're going to hold off on doing actual PCRs until we either have enough resources in the treatment area or once we start doing transport. So we'll get a patient assigned to, let's say, ambulance number 1. We'll load them up. Ambulance 1 will start doing all their documentation on their PCR once we're loaded and ready to go. Okay. Any questions about that? Awesome. So we're going back to our case studies. So what I'm going to get you guys to do is, if you want to pull up your care maps, if you can, we're going to do some triage of our MCI here. So I'm not going to get into treatment and stuff. I just straight up just want to triage these patients. So we've arrived on scene, as we talked about in our previous one. So we've arrived on scene, we checked our scene, we know we have 6 patients. We have a car wrapped around a tree. We have 2 people on bikes that were hit by cars. So let's check, we're going to do a sweep of the area and check our casualties and see how they're all doing. So our first patient we find is the rear passenger on the driver's side of the car. Okay, so if you remember in the picture, it's the passenger side that's wrapped around the tree, not the driver's side. So this patient is an 18-year-old found ambulatory on scene trying to help the driver out of the car. So you call them over, they walk over appropriately, they look at you, they obey your commands, and they say they just feel sick to their stomach, but they'll be okay. So how would we want to triage? What color code would you give this patient? They're ambulatory, they're not showing any signs of respiratory distress, they're obeying commands. So what category would this patient be?
Green.
So we got green. Everybody agree with that? All right, so green, 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 awesome. Yeah, so this patient, for what we're doing, absolutely green, right? Just the fact that they're walking and talking and moving around, that puts them in the green category. Awesome, so we've got one patient that is green. So the next one, we have patient number 2. So this is the actual driver of the car. So just to give you a little bit more picture on the scene, the driver was wearing a seatbelt. That's what the other patient was helping them take off. No airbag has been deployed, but they were wearing their seatbelt. You have a 17-year-old that was driving the car with non-specific chest pains. So that started shortly after the accidents. They're just complaining of non-specific chest discomfort. So they're ambulatory after they got themselves out of the vehicle, but now they're just sitting there refusing to stand and shaking up and start crying uncontrollably, and they don't acknowledge your existence. They're just sitting there crying. Their breathing is normal. It's at a rate of 28 with slight shortness of breath because as they're crying, they're gasping, but they are breathing effectively and their airway is controlled. Distal pulses are present with cap refill less than 2 seconds, but they have cool, clammy skin. What would you triage this patient as? What do you think? Okay, yellow, awesome. So why is this patient yellow? A lot of people would think this patient's green because they're able to walk around, they have good pulses, they're breathing appropriately, but what makes this patient yellow? What do you think?
They're not getting up, they're ignoring you, and they also have the clammy skin.
Awesome. So the big one here is when we look at our start triage is that they're not obeying commands. They're just flat out ignoring us. Also, someone just brought up in the chat here, potential deterioration and shock. Yeah, so this kid's got a lot of potential because he still has that chest pain too, right? So we can't ignore their actual injuries. So it's probably a seatbelt injury, which is very possible. So hemodynamically somewhat stable right now, but he's not obeying commands because he's too emotionally distraught. So we can't really gauge a good neuro assessment. And there's potential for further. But is he expectant or emergent? Probably not, but we can't just let him sit there for 2 hours either. So yeah, so this patient number 2 would go into the yellow category. Awesome. So next patient, so patient number 3. So this is on the front passenger side of the car. So if you remember the picture I showed earlier, that car is wrapped right around the tree. You have a 42-year-old who was hit on the head on the side of the door window during impact with the tree. So they actually hit the glass, broke the glass, and they have a head injury. They are completely unresponsive. They do not obey any commands. They are breathing with a rest rate of 26. Distal pulses are present, but they do have a large laceration across the right temple with profuse bleeding. So what does this patient triage as? What do you think?
I'd go with red.
With red? Okay.
Yep.
Anybody else? Red? Okay, yep. Awesome. So it seemed like this patient's red. Good, because right away, as soon as they're unresponsive, when we go with our start, that is going to be put them in the red category. Okay, so they do have a laceration across the head with bleeding. So as we all know with head injuries, they can bleed a lot, and it can actually be very distracting because as they bleed from that small cut, it can go all over the body and look more drastic than it is, but blood is blood. We need to deal with that. But yeah, but they have the distal pulses, the respiratory rates within normal ranges, but the fact that they are not responding to commands, they are unresponsive, that automatically puts them into the red category. So far for our triage, we have 1 green, 1 yellow, 1 red. Next patient, patient number 4. So the rear passenger side of the car. So again, if you remember the picture, they had been wrapped around the car on that side as well. So you have a 9-year-old that was trapped in the car due to 2-foot space intrusion into the car by the tree. So they took the most of the force of the tree. The patient, again, 9-year-old, non-ambulatory, severe pain in the right leg and a laceration over the thigh that is pumping bright red blood everywhere. You notice that they have an open right femur fracture. The patient's breathing normally, as per the scenario. Rests are at 24. There's no palpable pulse in the right groin, and foot is white and cool to touch. Skin is pale, cool, clammy. So what are we triaging this patient as? As red? Okay. Does everybody agree with that? Yeah, so I got a lot of answers. Awesome, right? So yeah, let's tourniquet that leg. I'm glad you brought that up because again, it's a life-saving intervention. we can't just say, yeah, you're bleeding everywhere, your femur's sticking out, let's go to the next patient, right? So tourniquet it for sure. Get a tourniquet on them as per triage so we can carry on. And yeah, this patient is definitely red. The fact they're pediatric, they've got a severe bleed. Again, I don't want to over triage because they're pediatric, but little kids have less blood than adults. So if they're spraying blood everywhere, they're going to get shocky very quickly. And again, open femur fracture, that puts them in the red. Okay. Next patient. So this is patient number 5. So this patient was one of the bicycle riders that was actually hit by the car. It's a 4-year-old that was hit by the actual car, was hit by the front bumper, then dragged underneath the car. The patient is unresponsive. There is no breathing. And maybe you feel a weak carotid pulse. What would we label this patient as? Or what do we do differently with this child because they're 4 versus adult triage? So this patient displays the jump part in the jump start triage. So because this patient's not breathing, awesome. Yeah, I'm getting all the text now. Yeah, so 5 ventilations, awesome. So we try our jump start with this. So we're going to open up the airway and we're going to try and give 5 breaths. We can try maybe around a CPR. That's at your discretion based on resources. But we'll say as per the scenario, you did your jump start, you opened up the airway, you gave them their breaths, and you still don't get any breathing afterwards. What would this patient be labeled as? Yeah, so just got it on text here. So yeah, we would go with black for sure, black or expectant, because again, we tried to get the open airway. We gave them their breaths. It didn't work. So now they go into the black category. They're expectant. Patient 6 as we triage here. So our last patient here. So this is a 29-year-old that was riding her bike as well, was struck by the car and thrown a couple feet from the scene. She was wearing her helmet. It's not on her head anymore. It came off when she hit the ground. She's currently non-ambulatory. She's dazed, confused with a decreased LOC. She is unable to breathe. She has severe facial trauma and has gurgling sounds and gasping trying to catch her breath. You do your head tilt chin lift to open up the airway. So she does start breathing again when you open up the airway, but she keeps getting blood building up in her airway. So what would we triage this patient as? Red, awesome. Okay, yeah, getting lots of reds here. So yeah, so she is red, right? So this patient, we were able to get the airway open and everything, but we need to do an intervention. So that puts her into the red category there. Did I also mention she has bilateral lower leg fractures and weak distal pulses? So if just the airway issues didn't make her red enough, she's got a lot of trauma going on. So yeah, this patient is definitely immediate or in the red category. Okay, so any questions about that? All right. So now that we've triaged our patients, what do we do with them? We're going to put them ideally in a treatment area. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. So a central treatment area maximizes the use of resources and incidents. So as opposed to having everybody spread out, we can actually combine all of our resources into one area. So we want to try and set up a treatment area. Is in the actual treatment area where we start doing extensive treatment. So this is where we're going to start doing more advanced wound care. We're going to start doing more airway assistance. We're going to look at splinting, things like that, bandaging. So the treatment area at the location of the mass casualty is established by the treatment officer, or it could be the incident commander based on available resources. And patients are brought there after being triaged and assigned a priority. So I just have a picture of the Winnipeg's MRV here. So right there, so depending on how many patients, again, if it's cold outside, maybe just like, okay, I'm going to designate this ambulance treatment area, this ambulance treatment area, and use your resources based on what's available. So in City Winnipeg, they have their bus, so they could use that as their treatment area as well. So the treatment officers, so they're the ones that run the treatment area. So we want to make sure that they're overseeing all of EMS. They're going to look at the actual resources. Sorry, I can't read my slide. I made the print too small. So with this, we're going to make sure that we're actually giving appropriate care. We're going to delegate our resources appropriately. We're going to make sure that we are, especially with our ALS crews, we're going to maybe divvy up our crews and have BLS in the lower acuity patients where we keep our ALS for the more higher acuity patients. The other thing as well, as we mentioned with STARS, is that they can actually help out with the treatment area. So if we actually have the STARS physician with us, maybe they could help us out with the treatment officer, not necessarily EMS personnel. So we could use that as a resource as well. So the treatment area needs to be close enough to the scene that can be effective, but not so close that it puts people at danger. Okay, so we want to make sure that it's safe. I think I'm just going to end up repeating a lot of this here. Sorry, I'm just going to skip through here. So where do we actually want to put our treatment area? So remember safety of both responders and patients, especially when we think of things like blasts and chemicals. We don't want to put it too close to the scene and, you know, the uphill, upwind, all that good stuff. We want to make sure that we're locating the area. So we want to keep that in mind. That's a good area for both us to work and safe for our patients to be in. So again, it needs to be close enough to the triage casualties to allow for safe and effective transport to that area. But we also want to make sure it's effective so that transport trucks can get there as well, so they can actually get the patients out. Something else to keep in mind is it's Manitoba. We get extremes, so extreme cold, extreme heat. So maybe we can find a sheltered area. Sometimes, especially with us with disaster management, they can bring in tents. So we work in a shaded area that's actually protected. Rain, snow, all that stuff. So that can make our MCI a lot more difficult to deal with. And it can affect our patients that are being treated. If they're already sick, shocky, bleeding, and now all of a sudden they're in a very cold environment, it's not going to work too well. So we want to try and find a treatment area that's going to protect our patients from the elements as well. Okay. And especially if we're looking at our resources, if we only have 3 ambulances and 12 people and we're going to have to get ambulances to come back and transport, we might be sitting there for quite some time. And if it's minus 20 out, our patients can't just sit on the snowbank waiting to get transport. We need to make sure it's safe for them. So there's a quick diagram here of a treatment area. So like I said before, the treatment area should allow for direct access from the triage or the scene to the treatment area, and then direct access to the transport area. So their patients are going to come in after the triage, they're going to get delegated to appropriate area, and then they're going to send out to transport. The big thing is what we have to keep in mind is that we want to make sure there's enough area for everybody to walk around each other. We don't just want to cram everybody next to each other, because if we're trying to give care, we're going to be bumping into each other, and that's not ideal, because if we want to give care to emergent patients, we're going to need space. So try to make sure your treatment area is big enough for everybody. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is just another setup here, we try to make the entrance as obvious as possible, so we could use lights, people waving them down or directing them, cones, things like that. One thing you might want to consider is, especially if you're dealing with bigger groups, is you may want to separate your expectant or your severe patients from your stable patients. So for this one here is an example I got where they actually park their MCI command center ambulance in between the lower acuity patients and the higher acuity patients. So that way the lower acuity patients don't have to see the higher injured patients. So there is that, you know, trying to reduce just that mental trauma of seeing all these hurt people. So hopefully trying to separate them can help. So that is an option for care as well. I don't recommend separating families. They're probably not going to appreciate that, but if you just have a bunch of random individuals and they're okay with being separated, again, try to make sure that we're not causing more trauma by making them watch other people severely injured and dying. So we try and reduce that emotional impact on our patients as well. So management of the treatment area. So when it comes to management of the treatment area, I have this picture here. So this treatment area here is a bit of a gong show. I'm not going to lie. This is from New York. So we have all our nice tarps and everything there. That's great. But the problem is we need to make sure we can get in okay and get out okay. So as you can see here, we want to start loading our patients closer to the back so we can get them out faster. And they get out of the way. So we move them to the close towards the transport, and then we start backfilling, because as patients come in, we just keep them to the back so new patients don't have to step over the old ones to get to the treatment area. So with this picture here, it shows the different colored tarp system. Awesome. So they know their delegated areas. But as you can see where that one ambulance is, you're going to have your critical patients go to the red tarp first, but they're going to have to walk through the green area to get to the ambulance for the transport area. Not really the best. Like I said, you might want to separate your stable patients from your unstable patients, because if you have someone just sitting there that's in shock just due to emotional trauma, and then they have to watch someone that's severely burned go carried by them into the ambulance, that's just going to compact that. So we want to make sure that our area is laid out nicely so we're not walking over each other or having to expose patients to each other. So when it comes to actual transport, we have the job of the transport officer. So the transportation group is probably the most work intensive and radio intensive role when it comes to MCIs, because you have to decide where to go. So with that, we can have a couple different resources available to us. So with that, we're going to determine which hospitals they go to, what's available. So for that, we're going to have to work with dispatch, and they can actually contact local facilities and see what we have available. I had one MCI where we had 6 patients, we had 2 DOAs, and we had 6 that we had to transport, and the local hospital said, we can't handle that, go somewhere else. Long story short, we ended up transporting to a City of Winnipeg hospital. Then that was after I actually physically talked to the ER doctor at the hospital there. So we have to try and organize who's going where, and that's kind of a big deal. So as a transport officer, you can work with dispatch. Like I said, if they have a designated dispatcher attached to us because of the MCI, they can help work with us and contact the hospitals and get back to us and tell us what's available for who can go where. Okay, but that's a transport officer ideally, so that way the incident commander doesn't have to deal with all of that stuff. They got enough stuff going on as well. So when it comes to using the helicopter, so we're going to determine how the patients are transported. So if we want to send the patients out by the helicopter, we need to set up an LZ. So we don't want to set up the LZ too close to the actual incident site, because it says here we could have rotor wash. So if anybody's seen a helicopter lands, like in the picture here, you're going to put up a lot of dust. And if we're trying them to land in a debris field and all of a sudden they start spreading the debris everywhere, that's not going to work for us. So we have to determine what the best place for the helicopter to land is, and that could be communication through us and dispatch and STARS, or STARS might just locate a more appropriate LZ. The other thing to keep in mind is that it may take an ambulance away from your scene, because if we need to go somewhere to go pick up the crew because of where they had to land, we may have to lose an ambulance for that reason to go get them and bring them in. Something else for considerations here is that if they need to land on the highway, we may have to change our entry and exit areas for our ambulances, because if the helicopter's landing on the highway, we may no longer be able to drive through that area. So we don't want to get trucks stuck behind the helicopter. And we want to make sure that everybody's aware of that, to take a different route to get to the scene if the helicopters had to land on the roads, and it's going to affect our egress. So again, like I said before, this was kind of talked about. So we want to make sure with the transport officer, we're talking to each other. We have an idea of which hospitals can take patients, because realistically, and I'm sure everybody saw this picture in the news when St. Boniface Hospital got completely overwhelmed. I think this was from over a year ago. We don't want to just dump everybody at one hospital. That's not realistic. Hospitals can only take so many. Even HSC, they're a finite resource. If they have another MCI going on, you've got your MCI going on, we can't just say everybody's going to HSC. We can't do that. We need to make sure we're distributing patients evenly. And so with that, that's when we have to talk with dispatch, and we have to see if we can, where we can take everybody. So depending on which facility we want to go to, the first question we ask is, what is the patient's condition? So are they all green? Maybe the local hospital can take all our green patients, and only the serious ones go to the major trauma center. So what is the treatment capacity of the closest appropriate facilities? So like I said, the MCI I had, we called the local hospital, and they're like, there's no way we can deal with that. We only have 2 open beds. So we have to look at who can actually take how many patients. We can't just dump everybody at the closest hospital. And what our transport resources are like. So do we have as many trucks as we need? Do we only have 1 ambulance that can transport? We have 10 people. That's going to drastically change. So we may end up having to take everybody closest just so we can get everybody out of the environment. There's a lot of things to consider here. So choice of hospital destination is obviously a huge thing. So like I said before, we don't want to overwhelm hospitals. We want to make sure our patients get to definitive care as best as we can. So ideally, we want to get them to the trauma center if it's a trauma issue. So we have our trauma triage protocol. One thing to keep in mind, if we're going to use the helicopter to transport patients, ideally the helicopter should go to the furthest hospital if they're going to transport. So usually they try to go to HSC, or they go to the city with STARS. So we don't want the helicopter flying people to local regional hospitals if they can go to Winnipeg, because if it's going to be a 6-hour drive but a 1-hour flight, like, send the helicopter to take them to the furthest hospital first, because again, just transport time for our patients. So trauma triage, this one was created to help us direct patients that should go to the trauma center immediately, as opposed to go to your closest facility, have them assess them there, say, yep, this person's really hurt, they need to go to the trauma center. So this is a way we can bypass local hospitals to go to HSC. So the first step here in trauma triage, if there is any of the following immediate threats to life, we're going to go closest ED without delay. So in the notes section of trauma triage, the closest emergency department, it means basically the closest emergency department, the shortest estimated transport time from the patient's location. And this doesn't matter what region you're in, it's whatever's the closest hospital. So if you're going to go over regional boundaries, doesn't matter, you go to the closest hospital. Okay. So if they have an immediate life threat there, so it's got the list there, so basically anything we can't deal with, and that includes if there is an ALS intercept. If it's just too much to handle, we want to go to the closest emergency department and get help with that. So what it might be as well is we may not actually offload. We might just go to the closest hospital, stabilize the patient as best we can, wait for stars to meet us at the hospital, or just stabilize and continue on down the road towards definitive care. If you're not sure, contact online medical support as soon as possible for direction. And if they say, you know what, just keep going, don't stop, talk to them. But ultimately, if you can't handle the situation, you need to get extra hands on it, pull up to your local ED, if even just to help stabilize the patient before you carry on down the highway. Okay. So next step in trauma triage. So man, I made this thing way too small. I can't see it. So next step in trauma triage here. So we're going to see if they meet any of the criteria in table A. So field trauma criteria. So decreased LOC less than 13, lower systolic blood pressure. Okay, so if BP is less than, I can't read it. Oh man, this is embarrassing. I made my slides too small. I can't see it. So I'm going to just change it here. So if we have systolic blood pressure less than 90, arrest rate less than 10 or greater than 29. So again, on the differences of extremes of higher and low, or arrest rate less than 20 breaths per minute in infants up to 12 months. Okay, so if they have that, we could look at going trauma triage. Okay, so again, it's not necessarily just going to be one thing, because if you have a patient with GCS less than 13 and it's because they're hypoglycemic, that's not necessarily going to fit trauma triage. So we have to kind of work with the situation we're in as well. So anatomical things to think of as well. So all penetrating injuries to head, chest, torso, and extremities, proximal to elbow or knee. So again, large major vessels there, so we always want to be cautious with that. Any chest wall deformity, instability, life-threatening chest injuries. So again, and all these ones here for trauma. 2 or more long bone fractures, proximal to elbow or knee. Crushed, degloved, mangled, pulseless extremity. So I don't think I need to go through the whole list here. It's pretty straightforward that these are all major injuries. So unstable pelvis, they've lost feeling south of their pelvis, things like that. They can't feel their legs anymore, can't feel their arms. Any major burns, high voltage electrical burns. When it comes to high voltage electrical burns, again, when it comes to triage of burns, I had one person that got electrocuted. They actually made contact with a very high powered hydro line, and they actually had no visible burns at all. We checked them from head to toe. We stripped them down to their underwear, and we couldn't see any burns, but the patient kept saying they could smell burning. Clothes wasn't burned, outward burns weren't present. So we're going to assume that they were basically cooked on the inside. So if you have something like that, it may not be presenting on the outside, but any high voltage electricity involved, that could fit trauma triage, even if it's not obvious to you that they're burnt. So other things to consider here. So your mechanism of injury, and this is a big one here. So what's our MOI? So like I said, if they have an altered LOC, but they're just laying in bed, that doesn't really fit trauma triage. But if there's actual something that can cause trauma to the patient, so if we have a patient that fell greater than 10 feet or one building story, then they can go trauma triage to HSC. For kids, it's greater than 2 times the height of the child. So obviously, depending on the age and development of the child, it's going to differ. So this is the one that we probably come in most contact with for trauma triage is high energy auto collisions. So intrusion into occupant's site, so passenger compartment greater than 12 inches. So T-bone accidents are probably the worst accidents when it comes to MCI. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Because when we get hit in the front or hit in the back, we have our seatbelts, we have airbags, we have crumple zones, all that good stuff. But on the side, we have a metal door. There are some vehicles that do have the side deploy airbags. I've had a couple calls where we've had those and they work really well. Actually, we had one person, they actually got hit, flipped, and their entire inside of the car was an airbag, and they were doing really well. But if you get cars that don't have that side impact airbag, basically you've got a piece of sheet metal between you and a highway speed car. So that's definitely going to be a concern, and probably want to do trauma triage for those. So intrusion to any side of the vehicle greater than 18 inches. So this one has been a topic of conversation because something we have to keep in mind is a lot of cars have crumple zones. So cars you don't have the big steel bumper anymore where you just like tank into things and it just takes it. So a lot of times now, because cars are designed to fall apart and absorb the impact as opposed to just hitting it, you kind of have to look at the bigger picture. So if you have a collision and the whole front end is destroyed, but behind the firewall at the front, everything is fine, is that because they hit it so hard and it destroyed it, or is it crumple zones? So we want to kind of look at, I don't know everything about every single car, but that's something to keep in mind when we look at intrusion, especially on the front. So obviously if someone's ejected from the automobile, that's kind of a big deal, so they go trauma triage. If someone died in the same passenger compartment, so there may be people that are injured in the same car, that doesn't necessarily mean everybody goes trauma triage. It's going to be very situation dependent on your assessment of your patients. But if they've enough of an impact that someone died in the car, it's a good chance there's other injuries. They may not be present yet, but there's a good chance your other patients may have severe injuries. One thing here as well, and before I did this presentation, I confirmed it with Dr. Hurd, was vehicle telemetry data consistent with high risk of injuries. So with that, what that means is that if you have OnStar on your vehicle and they have that auto alert for an accident where it's like it got hit at this speed, EMS needs to deploy it. So if OnStar has requested EMS be dispatched to this accident, that would be high suspicion when the actual computer is like, yeah, this is messed up, you need help. I would take that kind of seriously. So these ones are pretty common sense too. So auto versus pedestrians. So if you got someone that's been run over, they need to go to HSC. Impact between vehicle and victim greater than 30 kilometers an hour. So again, at your discretion based on what's happening. But again, someone getting hit by a car, that's not a good thing. So they would definitely be a candidate for trauma triage. And motorcycle crash greater than 30 kilometers per hour. So with motorcycles, again, I'm not going to get into the whole trauma thing. That's its own course. Again, you just don't have that level of protection. So the injuries from lesser speeds can be more pronounced with a motorcycle versus a car. So again, with your assessment, they could be a candidate for trauma triage. So some special considerations. So patients on anticoagulants or bleeding disorders. So obviously if there's a higher chance of bleed and they have some kind of traumatic injury, that is a huge concern. And obviously if they're pregnant greater than 20 weeks. So even if we're dealing with pregnant patients, we always have 2 patients. So that could meet trauma triage as well. Okay, so if they meet these requirements, we would want to go straight to HSC. So if you're within 30 minutes of the perimeter highways, so when we made this care map, we talked a lot about, okay, if we just say Winnipeg, that's going to mean different things to different people. Like Winnipeg is HSC, downtown, perimeter, what do you mean by Winnipeg? So we went with the perimeter highways, so 101 around the city. If you can get to the perimeter within 30 minutes of the accident scene, you could just go straight to HSC. Do your assessment, determine they meet the trauma triage protocol, and go straight to HSC. If it's within 60 minutes, and when this first came out, I got a few questions like, okay, well, 30 is less than 60, so do we still need to contact online medical support? So realistically, if you're 20 minutes, so like in our scenario there, we were 26 minutes away from Health Science Center, we could just load up and go trauma triage. We don't need to make any phone calls, we just make that decision. If you're within that 30 to 60 minute range, we want to contact online medical support because based on what our patient is presenting, they may actually direct us to go to the closest ED first. They may suggest that they send stars because it'll be quicker based on the patient, or they might say, yeah, just go ahead, go straight to HSC, bypass your local hospital. So we want to clarify that with online medical support before we start transporting. And if you really have a really severe patient, with any trauma, do it en route. We want to do a lot of treatments en route. We want to get these patients to definitive care. If you're past 60 minutes, contact online medical support. Start heading towards your closest ED because, again, they may redirect you to HSC anyways. Or, again, we may look at contacting for stars and see if they can do an intercept for us, and we can organize that. So where do we take our patients? So with this here, sorry, clicked on the wrong button. So when it comes to transport, so when transporting HSC, pediatric patients between 12 years and less than 17 years of penetrating trauma go to adults. So with this for 12 and up, for penetrating trauma, why don't we take them to children's? What do you guys think? Long story short, I asked in Winnipeg why HSC wants 12 years and up of penetrating trauma to go to adults. Yeah, all right, so I got surgical capabilities. For sure. One thing I was told is that just the adult side just has more experience with it. They just have the more resources to deal with those kind of those injuries. So if you've got a 16-year-old that's been stabbed in the head, HSC or adults deals with stuff like that a lot more than children's. So it's just their specialities, right? So that's why we want to take them with the penetrating trauma to the adult side. Okay. So if you do radio into adults, make sure that when you radio in saying, oh, we're coming in red with a 12-year-old, make sure you tell them we're coming in trauma triage with a penetrating injury, because otherwise they're going to say, well, go to children's, don't bring them here. So make sure you give them appropriate heads up that you're coming in trauma triage with a pediatric patient because it's penetrating trauma. So at least they know what they're dealing with. So make sure you radio appropriately. Okay. If you have a patient that is 12 to 17 years for blunt trauma, they go to children's. So penetrating 12 and up, they go to adults. Blunt, they go to children's. If they're under 12, any trauma, you send them to the children's side. Any questions about trauma triage? With trauma triage, it is definitely a dynamic thing to use. So if you have anybody that's really severe, go to your closest hospital, get them stabilized, and move on down the road. Trauma triage does not mean you don't stop at a local hospital to get help. Again, for those reasons, when they're severely emergent, we want to get the assistance, get them stabilized, and move on down the road. Or can we just go directly to HSE and get them care there? So it's going to be very dynamic. And again, based on just looking at the MCI things we've been talking about, you may have a car accident where everybody meets the criteria for trauma triage, but we can't just load up 12 people and go to health science center. We're going to overwhelm the hospital. Radio ahead, if they're like, yeah, sure, bring everybody, then that's your call. But we have to make some phone calls, because as great as HSC is, they can't handle 20 trauma triage patients all brought in at the same time. It's not realistic expectation on that hospital. So we may have to delegate patients to other hospitals. It may not be the most appropriate, but they can still get care. So when it goes to trauma triage, it's something to keep in mind. Any questions or concerns with that? Comments? All right, so we're talking about transporting patients still. So we have determined that our patients need to be transported, and we're going to use our tags here. So with our tags, the transportation officer, like we talked about before, will take the picture of the ambulance off the tag, and either they'll hold onto it or the incident commander hold onto it. So we have a record of how many patients we've transported. So as you can see here, we've got our nice tag here. We rip off the corner with the ambulance, and off they go to the hospital. Okay. So we want to make sure we have those accurate records. So again, like I said before, after everybody's been shipped off, we talk with the incident commander, triage, treatment, transport, make sure everybody's numbers match up, because if triage said, well, we triaged 24, treatment said we only got 22, and transport's like we transported 20, we need to make sure all our patients are accounted for, because people with neurological injuries, anything like that, they can wander off in shock. So we want to make sure we didn't lose someone along the way, and that is very important. So make sure you're using your tags appropriately. Before we get into the last part of our case studies, any questions about anything in the whole triage? Any questions? All right, so we've done our case study here. So we arrived on scene, we established on scene command, we decided how many patients we had, we did our scene survey, we called in our resources, we did our triage of our patient after we found everybody, and now we are going to, I'm not going to get into the whole treatment thing because that's not part of this, it's just straight up just how we deal with our MCIs. We're going to decide where do we send our patients. So for this scenario, again, it's within our region, it's in the RHA. So based our transports based on the capabilities that I know we have around Stony Mountain. So Stonewall is the closest truck, and any kind of incident like this, dispatch is always going to send the closest truck first. So Stonewall is closest to Stony Mountain, so they got sent. And they are first on scene, and they are acting as the on-scene commander as triage and transport. So you have your two Stonewall medics, so they are actively doing that. So that ambulance is actually not an option for a transport unit right now. You do have 4 other IRHA units available for transport, 2 on EMS, and 2 Selkirk units are currently on scene and are available for transport. And you have one unit coming from West St. Paul Station that will be there in 10 minutes. So you have a total of 4 transporting ground ambulances. You have a STARS touchdown. They're going to touch down on a field next to scene, so you don't need to send an ambulance to go get the crew. They're going to arrive on scene, and their touchdown is about 5 minutes. Your closest hospital is the area, because I understand not everybody's familiar with the area here. So from where the scene is, so Health Science Center is 25 kilometers. So like I said, going red, you could probably get there on a good day within 20 minutes. Stonewall Hospital is just a local community hospital. Doesn't have CT or anything. They have X-ray and lab, but they're the closest hospital next. So they're 12 kilometers away. So you're looking at about a 10-minute drive going red. Selkirk Hospital, that's the largest hospital within our region here. So it's 33 kilometers away. You're looking at about a 25-minute drive. And you also have Seven Oaks Hospital within Winnipeg, and they're 22 kilometers away and about an 18-minute drive. But that is an urgent care center. Okay, so who is the first patient we're going to be transporting? So I'm just going to go back one slide here, sorry. So we contact dispatch, and these are our 4 hospitals. So we asked dispatch, MTCDC, to ask what hospitals can take what. So something to keep in mind here is that we get radio back from dispatch, and they tell us HSC is currently able to take 3 patients. So they'll take whoever STARS brings, and they can take one on the adult side and one on the children's side. So they only have the capacity right now to take 3 patients because they have other incidents going on in the city right now that's using up their resources. Stonewall Hospital is able to take 2 non-urgent patients. So again, community hospital, they're not really set for mass trauma. Selkirk Hospital, they're like, yeah, we're open. You can bring whatever you got. And Seven Oaks is not really want to keep any patients, but they are more than willing to help stabilize anybody en route to Health Science Center. So those are your options there for transport. So now the big question comes in is, who do we want to transport first? All right, so our patients again. So okay, so this is interesting. I'm already getting answers. Awesome. So with this, we had our 18-year-old that was on the passenger driver side of the car that we determined was ambulatory, just complaining of feeling sick, and they were green. We had the driver of the car that was 17, complaining of non-specific chest discomfort, was crying uncontrollably, but hemodynamically stable, which we determined was yellow. We had the front passenger of the car, who was 42, had the head injury, was unresponsive, not obeying commands, was wearing the seatbelt, but had the laceration with bleeding. Okay. The 4th patient was the rear passenger side of the car, which was the 9-year-old that was trapped, that had to be extricated, that had the open femur fracture that was actively bleeding. We had the lady that was riding the bike that had the compromised airway that we were able to open and ventilate, but she had active bleeding into her airway. And we had our 4-year-old that was determined black on scene due to no pulse, no breathing. So who do you want to transport first? I'm seeing a few things here with the 29-year-old female from STAR is to go with STARS. Okay. Another one here. So head injury and responsive goes in first unit to HSC, child open femur goes to children's. Okay. And again, the nice thing with, I don't want to say the nice thing here, but with this scenario here, there's really no wrong answers because everybody's going to have their own experiences of what they think they should go first. So the 29-year-old female, yeah, like with her respiratory issues, yeah, we need to get that airway controlled. So with STARS, we want them to get, do an RSI, get an intubation in there, control that airway, because that's going to be really difficult for us to manage with an IGL, especially if it's bleeding from, and there's lung trauma and things like that. We would really appreciate STARS to help with that one. So I'm not going to disagree with that. So we've got the head injury patients. The unresponsive head injury goes in the first ground unit. And then the child with the open femur goes to children's. Okay, that sounds good to me. So we've got 3 patients taken care of. We have one that's expectant, so we're probably not going to transport that one because we don't have the resources. So we still have 2 other patients. We have the 17-year-old male that's walking around. Sorry, the 18-year-old that was just saying he doesn't feel good. And then we have the 17-year-old driver of the car that's yellow. Okay, so we have driver of the car could go to Selkirk. Okay. So the 18-year-old to Stonewall, yeah. So with that 18-year-old, he's green. So yeah, I got another one here, walking wound to Stonewall. Yeah, so they can handle the non-emergent for sure. Excuse me. So we could look at sending the green and the yellow to Stonewall, or what are we thinking? So with the yellow, so I totally understand. Yeah, let's send the guy the 17-year-old driver, the 18-year-old driver, sorry, that we categorize as green, send them to Stonewall. They could probably handle it. Right. So thank you, whoever put that. I was going to bring it up there. So yellow to Selkirk and green to Stonewall, right? Because Selkirk does have CT capabilities. They have ultrasound. They have a lot more resources. Because the patient we deemed as yellow, he's got that non-specific chest injury. So there is potential there for further issues. And again, we are sending our most critical to HSC. We've met their whatever they could take. So we've sent our adults, sent our child, sent our STARS to HSC. That's awesome. We trauma triage them. We're going to send them first because they're most emergent. The yellow can go to Selkirk because if they start developing more symptoms, there's just more resources at the bigger hospital. And also, again, if we go there, they go to Selkirk, they start decompensating and it start getting worse, they can stabilize them and then we can send them further south. So Selkirk would have more available resources than Stonewall would. So yeah, so green to Stonewall, yellow to Selkirk, I can agree with that for sure. Anybody else got any other ideas? Again, I don't want to say there's no wrong answers. Obviously, we're not going to send the red to Stonewall and the greens to HSC, but like it's definitely up to your discretion as the scene changes, who's going to go where. So I think basically most people have said the same thing, just from what I'm reading in chat here, is that the person with the unresponsive airway needs to be taken care of stars. Yeah, and the other factor is she got hit by a car, so she's probably got a lot of stuff going on, and stars says trauma right in the name, so yeah, that would definitely be a perfect patient for stars. The head injury patient definitely needs to go to HSC. They need CTs. There could be a lot of intracranial pressure issues, so they need to be assessed there. And open femur fracture, yeah, Children's is the place for that kid. We're not going to take that kid to Stonewall or Selkirk. The other thing to keep in mind with the ground units, like I said, Grace Emergency is available to help stabilize, but they're still an urgent care center. So if we are en route and for some reason we need to redirect to Grace based on what route you take to HSC, they are available to help stabilize as well. So just something to keep in mind with transport. So we may have to stop there, help stabilize, and then carry on to HSC. So those are options we have. That's awesome. So like I said before, I really want to give special thanks to everybody that helped make this project possible. It took quite a while to put all this together. So, and again, just contacting, and everybody came together really well, and I got a lot of great information from everybody just to help us make more Manitoba specific instead of the American textbooks we tend to read a lot. So again, just want to put a big thanks out to them. And that's all I've got. Does anybody have any questions, comments, anything they'd like to add?
Actually, I want to ask a question, but it was from before.
Sure, go ahead.
I tried to post it, but I guess I posted it wrong.
That's okay.
When you were doing the simple triage,
yeah,
at the beginning there, you were talking about systolic blood pressure.
Yeah.
This is during your triage. Are you finding, like, I know there used to be a different way that if you felt a pulse at the radial, that they thought the blood pressure would be, say, 80 or 90. But I thought they found all that wrong. So I'm just wondering, because it doesn't say doing blood pressures when we're doing the triage in there.
Yeah. So again, it depends on your resources. So yeah, again, that's a very good point to bring up. Normally when we're going to do triage, we're not going to be doing vital signs. It's just straight up, is it there, yes or no? Is this yes or no? So that's a very good point. So thank you for bringing that up. I just thought the scenario I actually got, I didn't come up with the scenario. I got it from FEMA in the States. They had different scenarios on their website, so I took it from them, and they had it as if somebody wanted vital signs, that would be what the vital signs are. But you're totally spot on with the comment that, yeah, if we're doing triage, vital signs are not really something we do. It's just, are they breathing, yes or no? Are they obeying, yes or no? Do they have circulatory compromise, yes or no? If you have lots of people, you might have someone do secondary vital signs based on what's available. But again, that's totally resource dependent. So that's a very good point, though. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, or anything? In case anybody's interested, there was a lot of references for this. I did a lot of reading. So I did record this session, like I said, so we will make it available to you. So if anybody else, feel free to contact me if there's any questions you think of later on down the road. But other than that, thank you very much for participating, and take care. Thank you.
Thank you.